Morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the students, scholars, policymakers, SAIS alums, and fellow travelers. My name is Andrew Mertha, and I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies and Director of the SAIS China Studies Program. Confronted by the unprecedented organizational changes taking place at SAIS, some 18 months ago, I began brainstorming with my colleagues Madeline Ross and Carla Freeman on how we could best continue the legacy of the China Studies program founded by A. Doak Barnett in the early 1980s, and fashioned as the sine qua non in the study of contemporary China under the 20-year stewardship until 2018 of Mike Lampton. The answer is what we're rolling out today, the SAIS China Global Research Center, a unique configuration of forward-looking stakeholders active in the shaping of US-China relations through the harnessing of Johns Hopkins' vast resources and decades-long engagement with China, channeled through SAIS and its three campuses in Washington, D.C., Nanjing, and Bologna. There are far too many people to thank in working to make this vision a reality, but some individuals stand out. Dean Eliot Cohen recognized the importance of making the understanding of China central to any bilateral and multilateral international engagement for decades to come. Mike Lampton, my predecessor at SAIS, worked extraordinarily hard to make the China Studies program the world-class program to train the next generation of China specialists in government and academia. Deans Gamze Zeytinci and William Roth and their teams worked side by side with us to make sure we could be financially responsible. Sonia Holmes and Pedro Matias worked tirelessly to make today's event a technical success. Carla Freeman, with whom I will work closely as we embark on this exciting venture, has helped create a unique vision for the center. And Madeline Ross, ably assisted by Bo-Chen Han, has done more than any single individual to make today's webinar one that brings together friends and fellow China specialists from all 10 schools at Johns Hopkins for the first time ever, if I'm not mistaken, possible. I'm deeply grateful for their commitment to this wonderful new project. Today, we also celebrate the publication of an extraordinary volume edited by Ann Thurston, Engaging China, that analyzes a half-century of engagement that formally began with President Richard Nixon's historic trip to China in February 1972. In my chapter in this volume, I write about what we as scholars have learned in that half-century, and I discuss a unique institution, the University Service Center at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, which incubated the study of Chinese politics as we know it today, especially in the 1960s and 70s, before scholars had access to mainland China, but continuing through to the present day. It was there that Doak Barnett conducted the interviews that led to his magisterial study of cadres, bureaucracy, and political power in communist China, published in 1967. It is there that my mentors in the study of China learned their craft. It was a place that transcended disciplines, approaches, and the turf wars of US academia at the time. In short, it was the origin story for much of what we know about Chinese politics today. The events of 2019 and 2020 in Hong Kong have put the future of the University Services Center in question. While its story has yet to fully play out, the inauguration of our SAIS China Global Research Center is an affirmation that even during this most challenging period in US-China relations, we continue to be fully energized and engaged in the art and in the science of analyzing the US-China relationship. And we are fully committed to bring a potentially unprecedented arsenal of resources to bear on this vital undertaking. We will carry the inspiration of the past half-century of scholarship, networking, community building, and continuity into the present and into the future. It is in this spirit of optimism and the intellectual firepower, hard-won experience, accumulated policy wisdom, and commitment to innovative and creative multi-pronged engagement that I inaugurate the SAIS China Global Research Center by calling today's event to order. The next three speakers will add a bit more context to our event today. First, Jill McGovern will talk about the broad Johns Hopkins University legacy in China, and there is no one better to do so. She's been associated with Johns Hopkins University and involved in its China initiatives for 40 years. She currently serves on a number of Hopkins boards, most notably on the Hopkins Nanjing Advisory Council. Next, SAIS Dean Eliot Cohen will speak to his vision of the SAIS China Global Research Center and the role of such centers at SAIS going forward. Finally, my colleague Madeline Ross, the Associate Director of the China Studies Program, will introduce the book at the center of our event today. We will then go straight into the first of 3 panels featuring speakers who wrote chapters in the book and commentary from Johns Hopkins University experts. Each panel has reserved time for audience questions at the end. So without any further ado, over to you, Dr. McGovern.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Andy Mertha, for that introduction and for your opening comments. I'm delighted to be here on the occasion of the launching of the China Global Research Center at Johns Hopkins School of International Studies. I'm, as Andy said, a longtime member of the Hopkins community, and today I have the privilege of saying a bit about the Johns Hopkins legacy in China, a history that has evolved naturally over a century to this moment with the establishment of the new center we celebrate on this occasion. The university's international roots can be traced to its founding, which was based on the principles adopted in the 19th century by the great German institutions of higher education, foremost the University of Berlin. When Wilhelm von Humboldt established in 1810 the university that now bears his name, he introduced the concept of research and teaching as inseparable tenets in graduate education. That idea was revolutionary in 1810, and it was the foundation upon which Johns Hopkins University was designed and became the first research university in the United States in 1876. Now, compared to China's thousands of years of history, Johns Hopkins is a toddler, but in terms of its impact on China for more than a century, it is a child prodigy. In 1913 and 1914, the university's 3rd president, Frank Goodenow, served as the constitutional advisor to the government of Yuan Shikai. Yuan had become the first president of the Republic of China, as most of you know, in 1912, and attempted to modernize China through a constitution and other measures. Now, this moment in Hopkins history and its early involvement in China may not be as well known as others because it came to a sudden end when Yuan abdicated and died shortly thereafter. At approximately the same time, in 1914 and 1915, the first dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, Dr. William Welch, had a much more profound and enduring impact on China. He was invited by John D. Rockefeller to lead a commission created by the fledgling Rockefeller Foundation to examine medical education in China at the invitation of the China Medical Board. Welch worked on the commission with his former student at Hopkins, Abraham Flexner, and they made recommendations to the China Medical Board about restructuring the decade-old Peking Union Medical College. The outcome was that the Peking Union Medical College was modeled on the Hopkins School of Medicine as prescribed in the seminal Flexner Report, which established the framework for modern medical education. The most important recommendation made by the commission, following the guidelines of the Flexner Report, was to train physicians to practice in a scientific manner and engage medical faculty in research. After serving on the commission in Peking, Popsy Welch, as he was known affectionately by his students, never to his face, continued his role as advisor to Rockefeller. In 1916, with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, Welch, along with Wycliffe Rose, designed what is now the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Welch became the first dean of the school, and its mission was combined focused on practical public health training and basic scientific research. As great as Welch's influence was on modern medical education in China, the number of Chinese health professionals who conducted research and trained at the School of Public Health over the decades may be an even more significant legacy. In 1919, another individual from the Hopkins community played an important role in China. Anna Wolff, an alumna of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and, School of Nursing, which had been established in conjunction with the founding of the School of Medicine, the Johns Hopkins Hospital, introduced nursing education to China at Peking Union Medical College. Later, in the period of political chaos in China between 1937 and 1949, and the subsequent establishment of the People's Republic of China, there were two authentic, independent voices on China at Johns Hopkins, Owen Latimer and A. Doak Barnett. During his 25 years on the Arts and Sciences faculty, Latimer brought in a knowledgeable perspective on China and Mongolia in particular, that was grounded in his field-based research in both countries. The capstone of Doak Barnett's distinguished career as a China hand was the 20 years he spent as head of the China Studies program at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Like Latimer, he was raised in China and was a master of Mandarin, attributes which gave him a keen understanding of both China and the US. In the critical stages of Sino-American relations in the 1970s and 1980s, Barnett's scholarship was informed by his extensive travels in China and his firsthand experiences in the field in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. Throughout his career, he conducted and published original research on the changing China and encouraged his SAIS students to follow his example. The Johns Hopkins University president at the time of Barnett's tenure at SAIS was my late husband, Stephen Muller. When the US established formal diplomatic relations with the PRC in 1979, Steve recognized an opportunity to extend the university's reach to China, which he regarded as the country of the future. Along with President Quan Yanming, his counterpart at Nanjing University, Steve created the Hopkins Nanjing Center, a graduate program that trains the next generation of Chinese and international leaders in Sino-American relations. Located in Nanjing, the center is modeled on the SAIS Europe program in Bologna. Planning for this true joint venture began 40 years ago in 1981, and the Hopkins Nanjing Center officially opened 5 years later in 1986. As the center approaches its 35th anniversary, it continues to thrive in spite of challenges to its very existence. Those challenges occurred in 1989, in 2003, and of course, most recently in the past year. This one-of-a-kind bilingual enterprise, however, remains a haven of academic freedom, with China's first uncensored OpenStack library at the heart of the Hopkins focus on research and teaching. The creation of the SAIS China Global Research Center, which we mark at this event today, is a natural amplification of the legacy of engagement by Johns Hopkins in China for more than a century. With the leadership of world-renowned China scholars, Carla Freeman, Mike Lampton, Andy Mertha, and others, the center will harness resources from every corner of the university, especially from the 3 SAIS campuses. The goal, to understand contemporary China and its global impact through research and teaching in the best Johns Hopkins tradition. Perhaps the next conference under the auspices of this innovative center will be the making, unmaking, and remaking of US-China relations. Thank you. And now over to Dean Eliot Cohen.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jill. I am truly excited and honored to be with you all here today. I want to express my appreciation to Andy Mertha, to Jill for their kind words. This is the right time to launch a center of this kind. There is no relationship more important in the world, nor will there be, I think, for decades to come, than the Sino-American relationship. And indeed, precisely because the Sino-American relationship today is difficult, and in my view, actually more likely to get more difficult, this is the moment to establish a center of this kind. SAIS is the right place to do it, not only because of the Hopkins Nanjing Center, which is, as you've heard, celebrating its 35th anniversary, but because of our long tradition of China expertise, which actually goes back even further than Doak Barnett to Paul Linebarger, one of the school's very first professors, who was a godson of Sun Yat-sen and who served in the American military and intelligence communities in China during the Second World War, and then, of course, through more conventional figures like Doak Barnett and Mike Lambton. And one of the things that has always distinguished SAIS, and which distinguishes my friend and colleague, Andy Mertha, is that combination of scholarship and policy engagement. That really is uniquely SAIS. Hopkins is the right university in which to do this because of its own history of scholarship about and practical engagement with China, which Jill McGovern has just described, because of the diversity of our connections with China across all of our divisions. That's one of the truly innovative features, I think, of this center, that it is designed from the beginning to be a One Hopkins effort, which will bring to bear all the resources and China expertise of this extraordinary university to deal with this single complex of issues. And perhaps most importantly, because of its motto, Veritas vos liberabit, the truth will make you free. The spirit of Hopkins and the spirit of SAIS is a spirit of fearless inquiry, letting the chips fall where they may. And I think that is critical and will be essential to the success of the center, but it is very much the Hopkins way, as Jill McGovern just said about academic freedom at HNC. Andy Mertha is the right professor to lead it. He is, of course, a distinguished scholar, but there's also, if I can say, a quality of street smarts that comes from somebody who worked not in academia, but in the business world, and not the easiest part of the business world in China, and therefore knows that country from the bottom up in ways that many scholars don't. Washington, D.C. is the right place. It'll be even more the right place with our impending move in 2023 to our extraordinary new facilities at 555 Pennsylvania Avenue, equidistant between Congress and the White House, right in the center of things in the capital of the United States, with magnificent public spaces that will give the school and the center even more convening authority than before. And this is the right way to do it. A center that will be open, that will be skeptical, that will be curious, that will be nonpartisan, that will be willing to entertain and listen to multiple points of view, and to debate them fearlessly and freely. This is very nearly my last formal act as dean, and it is a great way to finish my term in office. But I will say that as a professor, I hope you know that I am looking forward keenly to working with Andy and the China Global Research Center. There's a lot of work to be done. I am so pleased we'll be able to do a good bit of it together. With that, Madeline, let me hand the mic back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Cohen. And it's my pleasure now to make some remarks on behalf of Ann Thurston, who is the editor of the book that we are discussing today. Ann Thurston had very much hoped to deliver these remarks in person, but she's recovering from recent surgery and unable to join us today, so she asked me to read these intended remarks. I want to begin by congratulating my colleagues, Andrew Mertha, Carla Freeman, and Madeline Ross, on all their hard work bringing the new SAIS China Global Research Center to successful fruition. I also want to thank all those unseen members of the audience out there joining us virtually today. As it happens, the new inauguration of the new research center coincides perfectly with the official publication by Columbia University Press of an edited volume I've been working on for several years, which is very much the product of SAIS China studies and also a good example of the type of research the new SAIS China Center is likely to produce. The book is called Engaging China, 50 Years of Sino-American Relations, and I want to say something briefly, both about how the book came to me and what it is about. With respect to how the book came about, the initial idea came from SAIS colleagues Carla Freeman and Madeline Ross. The impetus for their idea was Mike Lampton's announcement in the fall of 2018 that he would soon retire from SAIS after serving for more than 20 years as the George and Sadie Hyman Professor and Director of China Studies, and also as Dean of the faculty for several years. Carla and Madeline wanted to find a way to honor Mike on the occasion of his retirement, and naturally, the first thing they thought of was a book. Mike, as I understand it, was wary of anything resembling an old-fashioned style festschrift that might be devoted to singing his praises. So he insisted that if there were to be a book in his honor, it would have to be a book of serious scholarship and a contribution to the China field. In any case, Carla and Madeline turned to me, wondering whether I might be willing to serve as editor and take charge of seeing the book to fruition. I accepted, and this book is the result. Pretty much from the beginning, we knew this book would focus on US-China relations and that its contributors would be distinguished China specialists from around the country. The first big step was to hold a conference at the Wingspread Conference Center in Racine, Wisconsin, which had been the site of a number of important US-China conferences and dialogues in the early years of engagement. We chose the site at least in part because we wanted to draw inspiration from some of those meetings, and we titled the conference, 5 Decades of US Engagement with China, What Have We Learned? We assembled a remarkable group of China specialists from academia, non-governmental organizations, and public service, a number of whom, like Mike Lampton, were on the verge of retirement, and others who were at the height of their careers, people like Andrew Mertha and Yanzhong Huang, who are also presenting today. I think that I saw the conference in some sense as a symbolic passing of the baton from one generation of China specialists to the next. Following the conference, of course, it was inevitable that the conference papers would be revised for publication, and we were very lucky to have Columbia University Press agree to publish it. I think several things make this a very special book. First, and most obviously, is the stature and gravitas and experience of the contributors, who are among the best of the best in the China field. Second is the importance and timeliness of the subject. 50 years of US engagement with China, engagement that is now falling apart. And third is that the book looks at the US-China relationship not solely from a government perspective, but from a multitude of disciplinary and substantive perspectives. So the book includes chapters such as one on Chinese and American perceptions and misperceptions of each other by Richard Madsen, Academic Freedom and Exchanges by Robert Daly, Trade and Finance by Craig Allen, Military to Military Relations by Chas Freeman, The Role of Non-Governmental Organizations by Mary Brown Bullock, and Cooperation in the Area of Health by Yanzhong Huang, the Economic Relationship by Barry Naughton, The State of the China Field by Andrew Mertha, and Issues of China's Response to its Geographic Periphery by Carla Freeman. The last chapter is by Mike Lampton, and it begins with a eulogy to the period of engagement, burying it while at the same time praising it. One of the readers declared this chapter an instant standalone classic. I think it's fair to say that most contributors to this volume would agree that engagement with China has been a net positive, but they would also agree the relationship was never simple or easy. It was always fraught with problems. Misunderstandings, misperceptions, blunders, and frictions were endless. It is not a simple picture. And that, I think, is also one of the strengths of this book. Finally, I would like to say that while the book is absolutely not a Festschrift, it is nonetheless dedicated to Mike Lampton with gratitude admiration, and respect for his lifelong contributions to the China field. This is now me, Madeline Ross, and I'm going to add just a few comments of my own. I'd like to say that when we conceived of this book in 2018, we were hopeful that it would be out in time for the run-up to the 2020 election, thinking that it would have an impact on the electorate's thoughts about China. But here today, I feel certain that the release of the book in the summer of 2021 is even better timed. Like the period of the 1970s, America's relations with China are now being reconsidered at the highest levels and in a thoughtful, systematic way in consultation with other nations. This book, a careful and very honest look back at 50 years of engagement, is well timed to add an important dimension to that process. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that it can be pre-ordered on Amazon and will be available July 11th. Finally, it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to my colleague, Adam Webb, who will moderate the first panel on U.S.-China economic ties. Adam is co-director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center, where he has also been a resident professor of political science since 2008. He's the author of 3 books, the latest being Deep Cosmopolis, Rethinking World Politics and Globalization from 2015. Adam, over to you with thanks.
Hey, thank you, Madeline. So I'm happy to introduce the participants for our first panel of this event, and this will be focusing on Barry Norton's chapter in the Engaging China volume, which he's going to discuss here, and the title is A Perspective on Chinese Economics, What Have We Learned, What Did We Fail to Anticipate? Professor Barry Norton is the Sokwanlok Chair at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. His work on China goes back to dissertation research in the early 1980s while he was doing his PhD at Yale. His work on the Chinese economy is focused on market transition, industry and technology, foreign trade, and political economy. His first book, Growing Out of the Plan, Chinese Economic Reform, 1978 to 1993, won the O'Hara Prize in 1996, and a new edition of the text, The Chinese Economy, Adaptation and Growth, was published in 2018. He's currently working on Chinese industrial policy, and our other 3 panelists will bring some diverse perspectives in economics and China studies. Michael Plummer is the Ennie Professor of International Economics at SAIS, where he's taught since 2001, and since 2014, he's been the director of the SAIS Europe campus in Bologna, Italy. He received a PhD in economics from Michigan State and was on the faculty at Brandeis. Since then, he's been president of the American Committee on Asian Economic Studies, has served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Asian Economics, and has headed the development division of the OECD. David Bullman is the Jill McGovern and Stephen Muller Assistant Professor of China Studies and International Affairs at SAIS. His ties to SAIS run deep. He received his PhD in China Studies from SAIS. His 2016 book, Incentivized Development in China, Leaders, Governance, and Growth in China's Counties, examined the political foundations of local economic growth in China. He's currently researching local economic policy implementation and the global implications of China's efforts to create a state capitalist welfare state. And finally, Sun Xian is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. She received an MBA and PhD from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and joined the Carey Business School faculty in 2009. She's published widely on financial markets and cross-border mergers and acquisitions in China and the US, among other topics, and received an Excellence in Teaching Award from the JHU Alumni Association in 2018. So without further ado, we'll turn to Professor Norton for his presentation.
Thank you very much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here at this reinvention of the fantastic Hopkins and SAIS tradition on China. It's especially delightful to be here as part of an event that is in part, it may not be a Festschrift, but it's certainly related to our respect for Mike Lampton and all the tremendous contributions he's made to the field of China studies. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the period of dissertation research in China back in 1982 that I carried out was also physically in the same place that Mike Lampton was in Wuhan. We were penned up together in the Foreign Experts building. And I remember many happy hours riding bicycles and talking about the amazing things we were seeing in China back in the 1980s. So when the invitation came to sort of systematically think back about what we believed, what we got right and what we got wrong during the process of engagement with China, I certainly jumped at the opportunity. I thought the potential to go back and rethink how were we looking at it then? How are we looking at it now? What really drove the changes in our understanding of China? Because I don't believe for a minute that we just sort of got China wrong and had some kind of rosy-colored beliefs about what China was and what China was becoming. Not at all. But of course, there were very important things that we didn't anticipate and things that we got wrong. So my chapter for this book was very much oriented around those initial questions. And my response ended up coming in essentially three movements. The first movement was to say, economists, generally speaking, didn't get China wrong. We got China quite right, I think. But there was a magnitude to the phenomenon of China's emergence that simply challenged the scale of imagination, that the impacts of China have been so enormous, and in part, I'll argue, driven by accelerators that were taking place simultaneous with China's emergence, that made it just pretty much impossible to imagine the scale and the impact of what was happening in China and the way it would change the world. And then third, I'll argue there are some things we got wrong. And in particular, the way that China, after about 2003 or 2005, the way the political economy from the top down in China shifted to a new set of objectives. I think we didn't see that at first. We were slow to grasp the significance. And as a result, the sort of scrambling to develop a new relationship with China, one that's a lot of people don't want to call engagement anymore, even though it still maintains lots of engagement, has been more of a scramble and more politically fraught than perhaps it conceivably could have been. So what about the first point? Well, economists, I think, got China right. What do I mean by that? I mean that from the beginning of economists' engagement with China, from engagement with the China economic reform process, economists tended to be optimistic, and they tended to believe that China was capable of dramatic development, growth, and change. I go back often to a set of lectures that Dwight Perkins made at the University of Washington in the mid-1980s, where he essentially said, China, look, it's got a lot of problems, it's got a lot of complex challenges, but to put it in the kind of very most fundamental, simple terms, he said, Japan did it, Korea did it, Taiwan did it, China's going to do it too. And so based on some fundamental structural realities of an economy like China, the basis was there. Well, if the basis was there, that meant really what we were focused on was policy change. And as we, I think almost all of the economists were very focused on what's the nature and direction of policy change in China? Are they making the tough choices necessary to move towards a much more efficient market economy? And generally speaking, what we saw was, yes, they were. And I think especially after the tremendous trauma of Tiananmen, in the economics realm, we saw policy reforms resume relatively quickly. When Deng Xiaoping did his southern journey, his imperial tour of the South, and then followed up by the 1993, third plenum, all of a sudden, the economic ideas, which had been, so fertily developed under Zhaoziang in the 1980s, and then so thoroughly crushed in the wake of Tiananmen, with blinding speed, they came back. And so there was a period there in the mid-1990s where economists were really a lot more optimistic than people in other fields, because people in other fields worried so much more about the political contradictions and the muddle at the top of the leadership, whereas economists tended to see the policy movement in the right direction. And therefore, when Zhu Rongji really had the authority in the late 1990s to impose a very substantial across-the-board program of economic reforms, when, despite pain, it worked, and we emerged on the other side of those changes in the early 2000s, economists essentially said, there, it's happened. What we expected has occurred, and it's occurred pretty much in the way that we anticipated. China's economy is much bigger and more successful than it was, certainly, but also than that many people from the outside anticipated. So there I am bragging about how great we are, we economists. But now let's move to the second point. I argue that from about that time, let's call it 2003, we failed to grasp the sheer momentum, the sheer impact, the sheer speed of change that was catching up China and, to a certain extent, the whole world economically. We didn't imagine that from 2003, the Chinese economy, instead of gradually starting to slow down after this extraordinary explosive growth in the 80s and the 90s, would instead have another surge of growth that was closely linked to its deeper integration into the world economy. Wow, that would have been very hard to predict, and none of us did. In fact, in retrospect, it's pretty clear that there were, I'm going to call them accelerators taking place that interacted with China's success in the reform process to create an especially dramatic process of change. I'm going to list three of them. The paper has four, but I'm going to consolidate two. The first one is the demographic transition. The demographic transition meaning, right, that the age structure of the population changes in a way so that the labor force is younger. The labor force grows rapidly at first, and then, especially in cities, slows down. Now everybody's very aware of the demographic transition. We're aware of the fact that China has come out of its demographic transition, is facing some downward pressure on its growth rate because of the shrinking labor force. But in the interim, before we got there, the different stages of the demographic transition contributed to China's rapid growth before we got to the current stage where it tends to be a slowing factor. And in particular, the stage of the demographic transition, the fact that the cities were ahead of the countryside in reducing young cohorts of people entering the labor force, meant that as the 90s came to an end, even though traditional state-owned employment was shrinking, and it was hard to adapt in some way, overall, the pressure of workers on employment markets in cities was easing off. And the result was that China was able to open up migration from rural to urban areas, let millions of people pour into cities, pour into new factories, pour into new export-oriented factories. Between 2005 and 2010, more than 10 million people a year in China crossed provincial boundaries, left their own provinces to take up a new life in new provinces. So there was this enormous structural change, and China sprinted to the end of its demographic dividend period, which came around 2010. Now, so that was one accelerator, right? The second accelerator was, of course, globalization. Globalization meaning lots of things, meaning the spread of electronic communication, spread of cell phones, but most centrally, the creation of global production networks. Global production networks, it wasn't all about China, but you can't imagine the restructuring of the global economy into global production networks that took place without emphasizing China. Everybody uses the iPhone as the symbol of that. It's an extreme example, but it's also a very appropriate example. Corporations that restructured where they produced, how they produced, to create much more efficient production lines that integrated production capability and low cost capability all over the world. And of course, just as this was occurring, and this is a sort of technological and business change, but this is occurring just as China finally resolved its negotiations on the World Trade Organization, entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. And it's not just that the specific provisions of the World Trade Organization were so important. They were important, but most fundamental is that it seemed that the entry into WTO had resolved the fundamental question of what China's basic position and basic orientation was going to be. And these things together created an incredible sweet spot for the global economy, right? So for 5 years, from 2003 to 2008, every country in the world virtually boomed economically. And the United States and China were powering this. And for a while, it seemed like it would go on forever, right? So this remarkable sweet spot occurred, as I say, right after 2003. And it was of a magnitude that it was somewhat intoxicating, but it was also creating change on a scale that we could scarcely have anticipated. And the third point, the third accelerator, as it were, is that because of the nature of these changes, because China's growth was so fast, because the global restructuring was so great, when we look at the US, these changes had very profound effects on the US, effects on the US that were much greater than I think anybody studying China could have anticipated. First of all, it was very good for American corporations. American corporations found they have a new market in China for many, and they have a new low-cost production base in China. Sometimes the same corporation, like Apple, sometimes different corporation. But American corporations became more profitable. Corporate profits in the United States were a little over 5% of GDP between 1982 and 2002. Between 2006 and 2019, corporate profits as a share of GDP were just short of 10% of GDP. So you can't say, oh, China gave US corporations all that money. That would make no sense. But you can certainly say corporations benefited substantially from the global restructuring of production, of which China and Chinese growth was a fundamental constituent part. And so, of course, corporations did well, the stock market did well, American owners became richer, whereas American workers were hit by competition from Chinese imports. The very important work by Dorn, Autor, and Hansen has shown that the impacted American communities didn't adjust in the way that classic neoclassical economics would predict. You know, we think, economists traditionally think that adjustment to new economic challenges and opportunities takes place with relatively little friction. But what Autor et al. Showed was when the impact comes, you get essentially a local mini recession. Adjustment takes a long time to occur, and therefore the costs borne by local communities is substantial. So here's that third accelerator, the accelerator that said what had previously seemed to be distant developments far across the Pacific in China, instead were brought home to the American political scene, channeling into changes in America that made it more divided, more unequal, and created many, many regional areas that were significantly negatively affected by the globalization of the period. We can't be blamed for not having foreseen these changes, but they certainly magnified everything. Now, finally, there is one area where I think we did get China wrong. And that is, I think we, the people who were watching China the closest, were slow to see the magnitude of the policy change in China after about 2003. Zhu Rongji committed to a version of marketization and opening and rule by law. Of course, he wasn't a perfect person. There were blind spots in his vision as well. But there's no question, I think, even looking back, that what his objectives were, what he was driving for. But since Zhu Rongji, it's been much less clear what the fundamental objectives of the Chinese leadership has been, including Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and certainly, of course, including Xi Jinping. And this uncertainty about their objectives has been fundamentally driven by a fundamental change in the relationship between government and society in China, in the economic sense. That is, after China resolved many of its most fundamental systemic problems, after it had fiscal reforms and tax reforms, a government that was deeply challenged in terms of its ability to raise resources gradually raised the share of taxes in GDP, raised its control over resources, developed new sources of resources from the land revenue system in cities, where cities were allowed to auction off land and produce very substantial revenues that way, by implementing a social insurance system that had all kinds of problems, was very partial, but allowed them to raise significant wage taxes. So just in this time, this sort of 2003 to 2005 period, China is shifting from being a state with a very serious crisis of government effectiveness because it's under-resourced, to being a state that has actually very substantial resources and has a great deal of leeway in what it wants to do with those resources. At the same time that this is happening, right, the Chinese government steps up its propaganda message about what's happening domestically. In the 2000s, as China goes into this second acceleration of the economy, growth rates push up above 10% again in the mid-2000s. And it's pretty clear to we economists that the ability of China's economy to do this is the result of successful market-oriented reforms pushed through by Zhu Rongji. But guess what? In China by 2005, 2006, nobody's talking about Zhu Rongji. His name doesn't even appear in the press anymore. All of the economic success that's occurring is being attributed to the Communist Party. And as the Communist Party consolidates its sort of ideological control over the country, it starts to express its desire for industrial greatness, great power status, industrial modernization, and for what I would argue is, to a certain extent, a challenge to the existing world order. In other words, to put it in one sentence, I think what we failed to see was that China's remarkable commitment to market-oriented economic reform was actually inextricably interwoven with its status as a weak state. Deng Xiaoping back in 1978 said, backwardness has to be acknowledged in order to be overcome. Deng Xiaoping was a certainly a committed reformer on the economic side, but he was a committed reformer precisely because he saw that China was behind, that it had been falling further behind during the Cultural Revolution, and that it needed to change to be great. But once China became a strong state again, so much of that commitment started to fall away. And I think we were so committed to seeing China as a reformer, sometimes more, sometimes less. There certainly were cycles of reform and progress, that after 2005, it started to become clear that China was going off in a new direction, and it took us years to call out how substantial and how important that change was. So I started off saying economists got it right, and I'm going to end up by saying economists got it wrong, that there was substantial changes in the last 15 years, which even today we're just struggling to master, struggling to understand, and struggling to see what their roots are in the broader Chinese political economy. There, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for a very interesting talk. So we'll turn to our panelists now, beginning with Professor Mike Plummer.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam. And I'd like to congratulate Professor Naughton on his paper, which I think gives an excellent review of what economists got right and what they got wrong in predicting China's rise. He takes a very wide brushstroke, and in my view, does an excellent job of surveying the issues. If I may summarize what I took away, they were mainly on target. We economists were mainly on target with the linear estimates of variables in the production function, as well as the evolution towards an increasingly market-based system until this century, until 2003, as we just heard. But we're very poor in predicting the institutional changes in the IT era and the general equilibrium effects on the global economy after 2003. Now, how these institutions develop over time is key to the nonlinear puzzle in any growth story, and China is no exception. Economists made similar mistakes in predicting the Southeast Asian growth path before the 1997-1998 crisis. Growth momentum was facilitated by progressive neoclassical reforms that were predicted to continue on their own logic. Failure to recognize the path of reforms in their current institutional context proved disastrous. But of course, China is unique in many ways. In the context of the questions posed by Professor Naughton, no country in Southeast Asia has gone beyond that desire to foster growth to the how do we do things great phase. Okay. So as a rule, we neoclassical economists tend to be poor in predicting institutional change anyway. This is less of a problem, of course, in forecasting short-term growth, but a major shortcoming in predicting long-term growth, to which this Chinese example attests. Professor Naughton notes that Chinese reforms were in fact linked to China's being a weak state, as he just mentioned, which of course is no longer the case. Perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that state dirigism with Chinese characteristics, now that's my term, not his, seems to be going the opposite direction these days. In recent years, the paper underscores that intentional economic reform has been feeble and rarely successful after Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji stepped down. Professor Naughton uses the commitments on the WTO as a case in point. Accession to the WTO was a great accomplishment. I think we all remember at the time how important it was. But the implementation of its special accession requirements, inserted due to the institutional specificity of the Chinese economy and its size, has fallen short. And he concludes the approach only makes sense in the context of a dramatically changed policy orientation. That's a logical conclusion, but it's interesting to evaluate its pursuit of parochial economic interests in the context of the current regime's rhetoric, something that I think is important, including for this conference. President Xi tries to place himself in the position of a fan of multilateralism, champion of WTO and rule-based governance. The Belt and Road Initiative is pitched as a win-win pro-integration program. And more recently, he has boasted about the potential of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was signed in November, and is an arrangement that brings together developed, middle-income, and low-income economies, which, after all, is no mean feat. And while it's often said to be an ASEAN-centric agreement, obviously China's role was instrumental in pushing that through. China is even talking about joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the very awkward acronym of what used to be the TPP, only without the United States. Premier Li Keqiang began to openly talk about joining it in May 2020 and has reiterated it several times since, including in March of this year. At the APEC meeting in November, President Xi himself echoed this interest and even mentioned the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, which would be a free trade area or a region of open trade investment, which would include all of APEC. Perhaps this is all rhetoric, and as an Italian romantic, I can easily be duped, but there may be incentives to move forward as a proactive global citizen. First, there are economic incentives, and this is something I've been working on quite a bit with my co-author Peter Petrie on the economics of these new initiatives, including the trade war and its in its current state of the Phase 1 agreement. And this trade war actually has been very costly to China. It's been costly also to the United States, but not nearly as much. And we predict over the longer term that actually it will be a pretty big hit if things don't go back to business as normal. The CPTPP and Rsap could have important implications for China, Rsap directly, and if China joins the CPTPP. And with the trade war and these regional initiatives, China will have a significant reorientation towards the Asia Pacific, with especially more intensive trade within Northeast Asia, because Rsap essentially creates a free trade area in Northeast Asia that didn't exist before, and especially in durables. And if I could just show you what our results would look like. Now this came out in a Peterson Institute paper last year. We predicted on a permanent basis beginning in 2030 that there would be a global hit due to the trade war of $301 billion. And more than that would be hit by China. In other words, China's hit is more than what the global hit would be. In more recent numbers, we pitch it even higher. It could even go up to 500 billion. Globally, the CPTPP and Rsap together pretty much make up for the trade war, even though there's asymmetric distribution of the benefits, obviously. And if you put China in with the CPTPP, you get a very large positive effect of almost half $500 billion above that. And you even get double that if you include some of the Asia Pacific states, Asia Pacific economies that have expressed interest in joining, including South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Taiwan. So these are actually very, very big numbers, and China could be part of this, and we don't have time to go into it. But obviously these global production networks that Professor Naughton mentioned are important for China and to be integrated in this emerging regional nexus of economic activity. And just looking at some of the trade effects, if you look at the effects of Rsap on trade patterns, everything here in green shows to an increase, but of about a $500 billion increase in trade due to Rsap, half of it is simply trade between China, Japan, and Korea. So what we're seeing is this reorientation where China will be becoming much more integrated into the global regional landscape, and that's important. And I just realized that I didn't share my screen with you, so none of you are seeing these things. So let me, hopefully you can see it now. These were the numbers I was looking at. This is what the general income effects look like with the trade war, and then the progression of these regional arrangements and the change in the trade patterns due to Rsap and that $500 million. So we're seeing this big increase. What we do see eventually, obviously, is a decoupling between the U.S. and China, and to some degree, the Asia Pacific. So there could be some very important economic effects to be taken into consideration in becoming this global citizen. But second, there continues to be policy incentives to reform, despite the context, as Professor Naughton lays them out. The IT revolution, and again, this coincides with that 2003 date, took place at a time of no global rules for the digital economy, and many other aspects of trade. In other words, it went beyond the WTO, what the WTO was doing a lot. And for the CPTPP, countries from Japan to Vietnam looked at that agreement as a way of helping them guide their own reform process. So Japan, a developed country, is looking for that as part of, beginning as one of Abe's three arrows. And Vietnam, as part of its program, are looking to it as sort of adopting these very cutting edge chapters that are included in the agreement. And if you look at the CPTPP, it's very deep. It's something the United States insisted on. And virtually all the complaints that the OECD countries have about China are covered in the CPTPP, from rules on state-owned enterprises to foreign direct investment. So it may well be that parochial interests will dominate, and that the leadership card being played is indeed rhetorical, but it would be in China's economic interests and would help it approach the leadership role it aspires to, and the world needs, I think. And so just to conclude, I'd say there's a very interesting paper that fits well into the theme of the conference, the making and unmaking of U.S.-China relations. And I should add that what I loved about the paper is it's a great advertisement for SAIS education as well, because developing strong economic and statistical tools to try to predict the future, as well as bringing to bear analytical perspectives from history, political science, and regional studies are really very important, and it's what we do at SAIS. So let me stop there.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Next is Professor David Bullman.
Great, thanks very much, Adam. And thanks for having me today. It's a great honor to be here at the inauguration of the SAIS China Global Research Center. So thank you to Andy Mertha and to Madeline Ross for setting this up and inviting me. I should also note it was an honor to be at Wingspread 2 years ago as this book was beginning to be discussed, and being on the sidelines there and seeing how this has developed has been really fascinating. So thank you to Ann Thurston, and of course to Mike Lampton for including me. It's also, of course, an honor, but a bit daunting to comment on Professor Naughton's very insightful chapter on what China economists got wrong and what they've learned. Professor Naughton's, of course, a titan in the very field whose shortcomings he aims to highlight. Much of what I've learned and what I've taught over the years has come from Professor Naughton. 13 years ago at SAIS in Professor Batellier's class, I learned about the Chinese economy from his textbook, and now I'm teaching my students from the updated edition. So makes for extra incentive to speak well right now. So this chapter was designed as a 3-movement musical concerto. In considering my remarks for today, I initially tried to be clever and lay out a sonata form, exposition, development, and recapitulation that failed miserably. It was unwieldy and came off as pretentious. So I'm just going to make several points that are loosely connected around one theme. And that main theme, is that Professor Naughton is being too harsh on American China economists, and thus also on himself. And I think in some ways he's too harsh in all 3 movements on American China economists, as I'll try to explain sequentially. In large part, my assertion that Professor Naughton is being too harsh comes from 2 divergences, I think, in our understandings and approaches. So first, I think it's important to differentiate American China economists from this broader universe of economists as a whole. the failings of the economics profession are in some ways more damning in my mind than the failings of the American China-focused economists. And I think in this chapter, these groups are at times conflated. A second difference, one that's perhaps more significant, is that we may differ on the rationale of Chinese economic reforms in earlier periods. In the chapter, Professor Naughton argues that under Xi, economic reform really became instrumental more than an end in itself. But I think this instrumentality, as he actually laid out in the talks right here, really characterized the Deng era, but also the Jiang and Zhu era. And this is important and gets to the heart of when changes in China's approach to reform could reasonably have been identified and what we can predict moving forward. So before expanding on the general theme that Professor Naughton is being too harsh, I should praise the chapter and note that almost all of what he's written seems entirely correct and deeply insightful. This should come as no surprise, although this chapter itself is an original reconsideration of the field. The analysis builds off of several pieces that he's written that have been highly influential in recent years. So perhaps most notably, the 2016 article on techno-industrial policy in China and the 2017 article on whether China is socialist. But to bring us to my theme, that Professor Naughton is being too harsh, as it relates to the chapter's first movement on what China economists got right, one piece that might be missing is Professor Naughton's 2010 article on China's distinctive system and whether it can be a model for others. And I actually think that this first section might benefit more from attention to that piece and to other works that have used the Chinese reform experience to glean lessons for global development. I agree with Professor Naughton that the overall track record of American China economists is excellent, but the accuracy was not only in predicting the essential nature and potential impact of market reforms, but also in interpreting partial reform outcomes. Explaining the effectiveness of gradual and partial reforms and second best solutions was extremely important. When I was a World Bank economist before coming to SAIS, these lessons were frequently and increasingly applied to developing countries around the world. So one thing this chapter might miss is what China economists contributed to the economics profession and development economics itself. In the second movement of the chapter, Professor Naughton outlines the unexpected impact that China had on the global economy, forgiving China economists for not foreseeing these evolutions and impacts. And indeed, the three accelerators that he discussed were largely unforeseeable. These include, of course, as he mentioned, demographics and the IT revolution and US corporate restructuring that led to supply chain relocation to China. This led to much stronger Chinese economic growth in the first decade of the millennium than was expected. So I agree with this conclusion, but I think the chapter might overstate this case of unexpected Chinese growth. Since I was very curious about how wrong China and other economists were, I looked at the IMF's World Economic Outlook's medium term, so 5-year future forecasts over the last 3.5 decades. So if we look at the 1990s, the IMF's 5-year future forecast underestimated China's growth in aggregate by over 50%. So a huge underestimation, and got OECD growth in the 90s almost entirely correct. If we then look at the subsequent period that we're focusing on here, the aughts, so 2001 through 2011 or so, the IMF underestimated Chinese growth by 27%, but this time overestimated OECD growth by about 10%. So to some, medium-term growth forecasts for China got twice as good, twice as accurate, and estimates for the OECD got considerably worse. And these bad OECD predictions and forecasts were not really just the result of the global financial crisis, but a general trend of overestimating advanced economy growth. I don't raise this just as a trivial point. I actually think it's very important for 2 reasons. First, I think the missed effect on American workers that Professor Naughton discusses has much more to do with our lack of understanding of changes in the US economy than the unforeseen Chinese growth. Simple trade theory would have predicted similar effects on scarce production factors, unskilled labor in the US. The non-adjustment of local communities in the US was what surprised, and this non-adjustment is in part connected to the broader failure of recognizing decreasing dynamism in the US economy that the forecast data highlights. Even in the absence of China, the supply chain relocation and IT changes that Professor Naughton notes would likely have led to similar effects on American workers. And these diverging economic forecasts for the OECD and China were also very important for understanding why I believe that Professor Naughton's third movement on what economists got wrong about China's turn away from market reforms is also too harsh. Although I definitely agree that China has moved away from unidirectional market reforms, I disagree somewhat on how far this shift has occurred, and more importantly, I think I interpret the shift a bit differently. So the chapter presents the shift beginning in around 2003 and sees this as foreseeable if China economists had really understood the underlying nature of the Communist Party. Once state capacity grew, the impetus for reform was gone. In this telling, this was sort of a predetermined endogenous process that was unrelated to external developments. And if that's true, then China economists indeed got China wrong in a predictable way. But I'm not sure that's a fair assessment. It seems to me that the unforeseeable challenges facing the world's advanced economies deeply influenced China's policy changes after 2003. So I don't disagree that increased state capacity made steerage of the economy more likely, but over this period, many reforms actually continued, reaching all factor markets in China, including capital, labor, and land. In terms of capital, banking reform was really far-reaching through 2007, and Nick Lardy has shown that relative lending to the private sector and investment by the private sector continued until well after the financial crisis. And the 2013 third plenum 60-point communique was, I still believe, a serious document related to many important economic reforms, even if implementation has been very underwhelming. In the absence of the global financial crisis and in a context of more robust Western economic growth, I believe that market reforms could have continued. But after the global financial crisis, many market reforms increasingly came under attack, not only by Chinese policymakers, but by Western economists. When Wang Qishan, told Hank Paulson, "You were my teacher, but look at your system, Hank. We aren't sure we should be learning from you anymore," I think he meant it. I've written about this elsewhere, so I won't rehash my arguments, but I believe that reform in China has always been instrumental, and that Western economic developments undermined the impetus for reform gradually over time in China. If this is right and reforms could have continued in a different international economic environment, then faulting China economists seems unfair. The different interpretation is also important for future projections. Since I'm already exhibiting my naivete, let me double down. And in some ways, I might be in good company here, because from Professor Plummer's talk on pressures for more market reform in China. But despite current conditions and all we've learned about the party under Xi, I still think it's too soon to simply say that market reforms are over, full stop. China's a middle-income economy. It faces a plethora of economic challenges. When Chinese policymakers today consider extremely important questions about productivity and SOE reform, the role of industrial policy, the relationship between anti-competitiveness and productivity and tech platforms, or the efficiency and equality trade-off, these are huge questions that I don't think they have anti-market ideological answers that are preordained. Reforms will still be instrumental, but much of this instrumentality is likely to favor far-reaching economic market reforms, even if there may be countervailing measures that still seek to strengthen the party state. So let me add a brief coda and then stop, since I'm at my 10 minutes. Highlighting things that China economists could have done better is an important exercise. But I've pushed back here a bit on the criticism of China economists, not only out of self-interest, but because I think that straying towards self-criticism can unfairly give ammunition to those who think that China experts have been uniquely incapable of understanding China's rise across fields of foreign policy, domestic repression, political development, economic reform. This is absurd, and especially so in the economics domain. Not only did Professor Naughton and his colleagues get the China economy right, but in doing so, they've helped generate better American policies and better global development policies, to say nothing of their important contributions to China's growth itself. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, David. And our last panelist is Professor Sun Qian.
Greetings, everyone. Can you hear me, Adam?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Jensen from the Carey Business School. It's my great pleasure to join this session today to discuss Dr. Naughton's book chapter, share our thoughts on U.S.-China economic relationship. The desire for more venues for open conversation like this one is imminent. So thanks again for SAIS for organizing this event. Well, first of all, actually, I had a moment, a puzzling moment of how to identify myself, because I heard a China economist and a Western economist. So I'm not sure how which book group, I should put myself in. I grew up in China, but I received the training here. But anyway, I enjoyed reading Dr. Naughton's chapter in reconsidering what we have learned and missed from China's economic growth. Dr. Naughton approaches with three movements. And the third movement in particular engaged my attention. So I want to share my thoughts today regarding the third movement. with you. It is about the policy change or the slowdown in reforms, in particular after 2013, which Dr. Naughton believes, it was misunderstood and or not recognized by the economists. And in fact, the disappointment that I read expressed in the text seems pretty, profound. It reads like no further financial reform, in some virtually nothing in terms of a market-oriented economic reform after 2003. So my first reaction is, well, this is different from how I have seen it. I see there are many significant market-oriented reforms in recent years, and several of our publications actually study the effect of these reforms on firm performance and industry level outputs. So for example, the 2005 split share reform made all state tradable shares, including large holdings by the SOEs, to float in the market so as to align the interest of the majority shareholders and the minority shareholders. And studies show this capital market reform is not a window dressing and has indeed improved the SOE's efficiency and profitability. Our study in particular shows that SOE's long-term performance did improve, benefit from this reform. And another thing I want to mention is the anti-corruption campaign launched by Mr. Xi after he stepped in the office. It investigated over 200,000 people, 150 firms, and of which 130 firms are state-owned enterprises, representing over 5 trillion RMB in the sense of the market capitalization. So given how pervasive government intervention is in China's economic activities and wealth redistribution, I think the campaign has worked in the favor of a more efficient market. Well, having said that, there's no way I think the reform, is enough. For one, the private sector, for example, accounts for 60% of China's GDP, 80% of the job creation, 70% of innovation. However, since government still plays a decisive role in shaping policies, allocating resources, so the SOE receive priority compared to their non-state, private counterparts in initial public offerings, product market, bank financing, merger acquisition market. So how can economic growth sustain by leaving out the needs of the private sector? Okay, but our observation of the reforms after 2003 apparently are different, but I don't think it's productive to convince each other that mine is right, that yours is wrong, or even try to conform to transform each other. I think more importantly is to understand the source of the difference. So I think it lies in the definition of the market-oriented economy and the expectations that stem from it. I actually don't know how exactly the so-called unique market-oriented economy will look like in China eventually, and I'm not sure anyone actually knows that for sure. But I don't think it will be like it will be like the market economy that we see in developed economies, developed countries nowadays, because of the institutional difference. The institutional hierarchy theory suggests that any composition of the economic institution in any country is ultimately resolved by political power, determines the rule of the game. And the political power is determined by political institutions. So at the end of the day, it is the incumbent political institutions set the stage for the evolution of economic reforms. Economic institutions may reform within the hierarchy, but they must reform in the interest of the chosen de jure political institution, which is generally durable, persistent once established. So without a sufficiently large change in the distribution of political power, drastic change in economic reform are not likely to happen. So I do not hold an expectation that China will reform into a market economy like one we see, for example, in US. And the largest two economies in the world nowadays, they are thriving, because of different reasons. For example, the market capitalization is 150% of US GDP. And the China's market capitalization, capital market, is only 60% of its GDP. China indeed needs more reforms and more profound ones, especially in the financial market, so that households have more investment options than buying houses or saving it in a bank, so that the private sector gets funds they need to support growth. So the challenge now is how to promote more and profound reforms in China while the political power remains stable, which I believe it will be the case for a while. So I think it's still possible. We always need a top-down, supportive policies, but a peaceful bottom-up approach is also likely. So suggested by A.C. Manku in the institution hierarchy theory, another source of political power, which is not specified by the Constitution, may rise because of the increased wealth accumulation. So a group possesses more power in resources redistribution, thus possessing the so-called de facto power. And de facto power may have emerged in China in the past 3 decades of fast economic growth. The rapid growth not only lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty, but also created a group of the so-called super rich. The Hurun Global Rich List reported that in 2019, out of the 257 billionaires in the world, 609 were from China and 552 from US. And with most of the richest Chinese being the founders of private enterprises. Some of them, they got their share of wealth accumulated by collaborating with the state in these so-called strategically important industries, but many of others, private entreprises, entrepreneurs, they flourish the emerging industry sectors such as online shopping platforms. So my recent study with my co-authors suggests that the de facto power has exerted its influence in the development of local supportive economic institutions and policies that actually benefits all firms in the area. So this is another source of the force of continuing market-oriented reform. I believe the de facto power may continue to exert influence on such institutional changes. But the road is bumpy. The recent IPO of Ant Financial, now changed the name to Ant Group, an affiliate of Alibaba, tested the boundary of how much the state is comfortable at the role of the private sector in a financial market, which has to be and is still a state-dominant one. So in sum, I really enjoyed reading Dr. Naughton's book. It brought me to think a lot about our differences and then more importantly, the sources of the difference. And I really appreciate the chance to exchange thoughts on economic, ties between U.S. and China with everyone. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you all for your initial thoughts and to Professor Norton for his presentation to get us started. At this point, we'll open up for a more free-ranging discussion among the panelists, as well as questions from our audience. If audience members wish to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A section at the bottom in Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the 35 minutes or so that we have left. I'll get us started with one question, which is, I guess, in the intersection between economics and politics. A few years ago, the leadership in China made pretty clear the hierarchical sequencing of priorities, with maintaining the regime being first, maintaining territorial integrity being second, and supporting economic growth being third. And there are, as there have been in many countries, scenarios where 1 and 3, namely maintaining the regime versus economic flourishing, can come into tension and generate important divergences of interest between state and key economic interests. And I think picking up on what Professor Sun was just saying as well, I'm wondering with the economic costs of disengagement or the economic costs of a potential stagnation of the current economic model, in what segments of more advantaged layers of Chinese society would the impact of that kind of economic slowdown or pressure fall, and through what mechanisms and to what extent? In other words, are there scenarios where some economic impacts of disengagement or economic slowing could generate a parting of ways between key economic stakeholders and the regime?
Do you want me to reply? You're muted now.
Yeah, maybe you could start, and then maybe the panelists want to have a comment as well after that. But yeah,
Sure.
Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, let me answer that question along with what I take as one of the main common points among those really interesting comments, for which I'm really super grateful. I mean, I think it's fair to say that in a way, each of the three commentators suggested that I was too pessimistic about both the reality and the prospects for continued market-oriented reforms in China today. So let me say two things about that. First, let me just retreat a second. Maybe I was a little too, across the board in that statement. But my fallback position is, what's clear is that during the 90s, and especially with somebody like Zhu Rongji, market-oriented reform was a goal in itself, and that it involved unleashing all kinds of new economic forces, and where the objective was to allow those forces to compete fairly. All right, and that's sort of the definition of market-oriented reform, right? Lower entry barriers, more fair competition. Today, it's not that there aren't any measures that can be classified as reform. Certainly there are some, and Professor Sun mentioned a couple in the financial sector. But what's also clear is that those are no longer seen as objective in and of themselves, but are rather as seen as part of a more efficient authoritarian system which deploys state resources more effectively and takes advantage of a new technological revolution which China is determined to master. In other words, other objectives are clearly superior to the market reform objectives, and market reforms are seen as instruments. And I think, then to kind of advance a little from that fallback position, which I think is pretty clearly true, I would say, therefore, when we look at specific reforms, we're going to see them differently because of these different interpretations of what the objective is. How do we think China is doing in the WTO? I think China is doing quite poorly in the WTO, even though, according to WTO dispute settlement bodies, it's doing pretty well, right? But if you really look more deeply at the principles that drive interactions in the WTO, I think China is in sort of deep philosophical violation. For that reason, I think the chance that China will go into CPTPP are zero. It's not going to happen. It's just rhetoric. And so yeah, I'm more pessimistic because these measures are taking place along with measures that are increase state power and represent a rollback of the force of the market, in my judgment. But admittedly, that's more a question of judgment. And therefore, to get to Adam's question, I think in the short run, there's nothing that's going to cause them to change their orientation, because Xi Jinping is so dug into this vision that everything is a security issue. That, yeah, he'll make concessions when he thinks it's in his interest to make concessions. He believes in protracted warfare, but they're not real concessions. And so I do think there will come a time, but it might be 5 years away, when probably a new generation of Chinese policymakers will say, wow, the reaction against us in the world is to some extent our own making, and maybe we should rethink this orientation. And then China will emerge as a great power and as a leader in the international economy and political system.
Do any of the panelists have any comment on any of that?
I mean, I would.
Yeah,
I guess in my comments, I was more optimistic, more because I assumed that other panelists would probably also be pessimistic. I think there's a general pessimism on the potential for Chinese market reform. So I'm optimistic that one day maybe we'll see much greater market reforms. I don't see that, of course, as happening tomorrow under Xi. I agree that he sees things through a security perspective. In terms of your question, Adam, the way I see it, I do see China's economic reforms as responsive and instrumental to keeping the party in power. When we look at what sectors have been pressured, for instance, by the trade war, I think the trade war has in many ways undermined the potential for market reform, because who did it hurt? It hurt the small private sector, small private sector exporters more than anyone else. And these interests, they're not able to convince the party to change policy, and it also leads to the party doubling down on certain forms of techno-industrial policy and so I don't see the current external pressures.
Please come on in. I'm very sorry I've messed up my schedule and I'm on a Zoom thing. But
sorry,
come on
Barry,
upstairs.
you're not muted, Barry. No problem. In any case, I partially lost my train of thought, but I do think, if you look at Chinese economic growth over the last decade, really since 2011, many different analyses and different approaches have found that total factor productivity has basically disappeared, right? Growth has been completely capital intensive, and productivity's gone down. And this has been largely driven by the lack of entry for the most part, right? And that has stemmed from a lack of exit of unproductive firms, zombie firms. Oftentimes these are large SOEs, but they're not always SOEs. They're often just large firms in small localities that local government don't want to shut down. I think there's a real tension between the center and local governments on whether to shut these down. Right, because no one wants to lose employment. That's the key driver when you think about things that could threaten the CCP. Right, lack of employment is a big deal. So how to deal with these zombie firms is, I think, extremely challenging, and is an area where you could see more market reforms pushed by the center in order to try to deal with this. So I do think there are tensions, and there are things will have to give. Right, the economy as it's currently structured, I don't think can continue chugging forward with that much state intervention and 6% growth rates. I don't see it happening, but who knows where that will turn.
We have some questions coming in the Q&A box here. One is from Li Zhuoran, and the question is relating to the US having just announced its own industrial policy as a counterweight to China. And the question is, given that according to your grand steerage theory, China's industrial policy is extremely wasteful, do you think the US is overreacting to China's industrial policy? Should we just wait for them to trip themselves? In other words, is US industrial policy a kind of an overreaction or a reaction that's not necessary to a Chinese industrial policy that may backfire in certain ways or be self-limiting?
So it's a funny thing right now, right? We clearly see China and the US moving in the same direction, in the sense they are both, relative to what they were a few years ago, they're both adopting more industrial policy. But they're not really converging, because the magnitude of China's ambition is still vastly greater than the magnitude of the American ambition. So so there were sort of two parts to that question. It's a great question. I mean, one part is China's vast expenditure of resources on industrial policy so wasteful that we should just let it do it and wait for it to collapse? And the other part was, are we emulating them in that wastefulness? I think the answer to both those questions is no. China is a great country. It has lots of smart engineers and lots of smart business people. And it's a big country. So the government can waste a lot of money and still have lots of positive outcomes. I mean, I agree with David's assessment of the kind of productivity trends in the last few years and what some of the drivers are. But, countries can move forward with, with a zero productivity growth for quite a while, as long as they can take care of some of the financial issues. I don't see China as being, near to collapse or near to something that would force it to change course. And the relatively modest steps that the US is taking, I think, are probably necessary as a response. So I think it's unfortunate that we're trapped in this system where we both feel that we have to respond to the other. That's kind of the essence of the security dilemma, but we are, and I don't see an immediate way out.
If I could just mention, I agree with that, that last point. And I think that in the US case, that it's being driven a lot by politics, this new industrial policy, as it was against Japan in the 80s. I think there are some parallels there. So I think that in those games, we do a very poor job, but I do agree that this new inward-looking approach of the administration and the rise in this, the turning back the clock on reforms and things like that, it's going to be a problem for productivity going forward and for Chinese growth, et cetera. And employment is still going to be an issue going forward. I think that is going to be, we'll see what happens with the trade war. But I think we've in U.S.-China relations, and I guess this is better, probably political scientists are better talking about that. It seems that they are at such a bad point right now that one can't really think about policy except in a game theoretical perspective. So I'm not sure that we're seeing really independent decisions that would be optimal. So.
We have a question from James Mann, slightly different angle on this. You laid out well what economists did and didn't get right, and the question concerns what economists didn't say or study while they might have. And it says in light of the Auto study on the impact of the WTO on American workers and localities, should economists have looked more closely in advance at what the impact of China's WTO membership would have been? In other words, not so much whether economists get the answers right or wrong, but did they ask the wrong questions about this, or did they neglect? I think the question is implying certain social impact of economic engagement, perhaps.
That's a really difficult and incisive question, just the kind of question you'd expect from Jim Mann. So, I mean, I certainly wouldn't give economists an A+ grade on thinking about the WTO impact, but I do think to a certain extent it was. I mean, I think in many ways what was hard to envision. There was this period, I think it started about 2004, where all of a sudden, let's say you had an idea to make something, let's say a toy or something, just existed in your brain. And you only wanted 500 at first because you weren't sure if it'd be popular. All of a sudden, there were businesses in Los Angeles and Pittsburgh and places where you could go to that business and say, hey, I want 500 of these made in China. And they would do the contracting and fill a container full of, bring it to the port of Los Angeles. It was so frictionless to move production to China, so cheap. And yet it was hard to imagine that the frictions involved in people shifting their jobs in Pittsburgh from heavy industry to medical care were far greater and much more difficult. So I think that was a kind of huge philosophical shift in understanding that the changes in the economies were so big, and the change in the relative costs of transport versus retraining were so enormous, that I think given the traditional orientation of economists in favor of free trade, it would have just been asking too much. And then finally, the other thing is WTO is so complicated. Nobody really understands WTO except the people who specialize in it. And I would say 10 years ago, I didn't understand WTO. I've spent 10 years trying to, have some remedial education, but there's still parts of it that are beyond me. So it's, yes, it was a failing, perhaps understandable.
I agree with Dr. Naughton. You know, it will be really hard to back then to study this particular question, how China's WTO membership would affect U.S. workers. But economists could do, I think, or could predict based on the understanding of the changes that U.S. corporations had been going through at that time. Actually, may give some implications on the in the labor market, like Dr. Naughton mentioned in his book. The changes that the U.S. corporation was going through by building, off the inefficient parts and focusing on R&D and technology. Another trend emerging around the 2000s was that many U.S. companies actually decided to grow faster by merging or combining with another company through merger acquisitions, instead of going through the initial public offering to become a publicly listed company. So there's a competition going on in the U.S. market, especially among the large U.S. corporations, to get a bigger, grow faster, so as to survive and stay in the market, stay in a position. So in order to do so, they would constantly looking for projects that have a higher growth than they have ever seen before, and they'll constantly try to spin off and sell or outsource those sections, those business segments that are low profit margin to somewhere else. So if it is not in China, it will be somewhere else in the labor intensive market. Well, of course, because of the IT shock, because of the WTO, because of the rise of Apple, the launch of iPhone and iPad, right? It turned out to be that now when we look at the significant amount of profits Apple has made, partly, it comes from their strategy of outsourcing the production, outside of the U.S. But it is not the single factor, right? Like Dr. Naughton mentioned, it's a combination of many factors that are occurring at the same time.
Yeah, and just to highlight and just to complement that, I mean, I think trade and labor economists, getting back to the point I made earlier, I think got China's accession wrong and got the changes in the 2000s wrong a lot more than China economists got wrong China's growth and its impact, right? I mean, if we think about what's going on with the trade war, right? If the problem were China's entry, then the trade war with massive tariffs should lead to more production relocating back to the U.S. And I haven't seen any evidence that it's happening, right? The evidence seems to be that prices have gone up somewhat and that there's been a lot of relocation to other countries, right? Other labor-intensive countries, as Professor Sun was saying. So I don't think that rethinking what China's impact would have been enough. This was a context of massive globalization and changes in global supply chains that was not simply based on China.
And another set of footnotes to what Professor Sun said is, at the same time that WTO membership occurred, Taiwan decided, okay, things with China are okay. We don't need to prevent our electronics manufacturers from setting up plants in the mainland, which they had always done before. So you had this massive movement of laptop production over to China, which also caused a surge in Chinese exports. And the multi-fiber agreement ended. So China, which had been quota limited for textiles, all of a sudden was free to export quotas. So in retrospect, we needed to put all these things together, and that was really hard to do. But the bottom line is, we had decided that China wasn't quite acting like a responsible stakeholder yet, but had made a fundamental commitment to join the global system, more or less on the terms of the system as it was. And today that seemed a lot less certain.
We have a demographics question from Rebecca Feaster. Do you think that the Chinese government will implement any pro-growth policies to decrease the elderly population and increase the baby population? So we're seeing a lot about the demographics of China and the economic implications of that, and some attempts at policy responses that don't seem to be having that much impact. I wonder if you have any thoughts on policy instruments and whether or not they would actually have any effect on the seems pretty substantial demographic challenges?
It seems very unlikely, right? I mean, in my understanding, the only society that's really been successful in bringing their birth rates back up has been Sweden. And Sweden has done that really by having a very liberal social attitude. So people have second families in their 40s and strong social support. I don't think China's quite ready for that. Then I think they're more in the pack of countries that have tried to cause a boost in birth rates and failed. From Singapore to Korea, that's more the situation that we see. So I don't expect a big change.
We have a question from Elaine Hua. How do you see Biden's call on the electric vehicle industry? What will competition between the US and China in this field, including battery business, turn to be? So that's a fairly specific sectoral question. So whether on that sector or on any other sort of cutting edge sectors, how you see the landscape of competition?
Sure. I mean, maybe the best thing is to divert that question just a little bit to something that leads me to a more positive evaluation of Chinese policy, even though industrial policy is pretty wasteful, and EV policy in the past in China has been very wasteful. It's been colossal failure. Maybe they're starting to get it right now, but they certainly paid a lot in terms of learning costs. But one way to look at all this is just that there is a cluster of technological breakthroughs occurring that is making Silicon Valley rich, is making a few American corporations very, very wealthy, because this is a fundamental exogenous change that is going to change the economic structure of all our economies. And from that perspective, you can say, well, China maybe bent the rules a little bit, but they did ensure that, some of the key internet giants are Chinese, that some of the key AI breakthroughs are taking place in China, that some major electric vehicle producers will be in China. And it might turn out to be the case that this sort of historical choice was worth making, even at the cost of some very substantial distortions. But we won't know that for another decade or two.
Anyone else have any thoughts on the cutting edge sectors in competition? I have a slightly different question about maybe what was foreseeable and its implications. I think back in the 1990s, I remember when people were debating extending normal trade relations and so on, and much of the debate about the political or social implications of tighter economic ties with China was merely that this would somehow reinforce certain practices within China, or it would remove pressure on a repressive regime, and whether trade and human rights should be linked and so on. One thing obviously that we have seen over the last 20 years is the extent to which at least key sort of economic sectors, institutions in the West have had their own economic interests deeply intertwined with China and influenced by them, to the point that this actually ends up, in many accounts, influencing the foreign policy and the positions of Western governments. I wonder to what extent that was foreseeable or downplayed. And there certainly haven't been any precedent of a non-Western, non-liberal power having that extent of economic influence in the West earlier, and predicting how key interests in the West would react to that influence and whether that would constrain Western policy. I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether people didn't foresee that or not.
We should probably bring Jim Mann back in for that question, right? I think he'd have a strong view on that. I mean, to me, the problem is not so much that occurs, but rather that, to a certain extent, the political economy of the United States and France and Germany is, based on the idea that those kind of interest groups will have an influence on foreign policy. and it's seen as legitimate and to be checked to a certain extent. And then, of course, everybody's supposed to fall in line on national interest. But I mean, if we ask what USTR does, to a certain extent, USTR responds to the requests and lobbying of American corporations. And I don't think that's a flaw. I think that's a feature. But it puts us in a very difficult position sometimes dealing with China where that's not true, right? Where the insistence is that a unified national position be developed, and then most of the time people are supposed to fall in behind that unified position.
A question from Jing. How do you think China would respond to the global minimum corporate tax initiative? And I guess that could broaden to other sort of efforts to change economic models that may require cooperation across countries.
I think they will immediately ask for an exemption. They will immediately say, well, we have a very special circumstance domestically, so we think this is a wonderful idea for you guys internationally, but we should be exempt for our domestic rules.
I think that's probably right. I mean, when I was at the OECD, I saw that type of disconnect always. It was the OECD countries saying, you're a peer, we're going to treat you as a peer, and China's response was always, we're a developing country, need more flexibilities. But if I might say, I'm a bit cynical about the minimum corporate tax myself, that, the US lawyers always find a great way to sort of evade these things. So I'm wondering if, I think it's in principle, it's a great idea, but whether or not it goes through even in the United States, I think is yet to be seen if something could be developed. I mean, the WTO is complicated, trade law is complicated, tax law is complicated. So unfortunately, we are experts at finding loopholes. So we'll see.
I see an interesting question here from Derek Engel. He says he's a naval officer stationed in DC and heading to Singapore. This is picking up on the demographic questions that came up earlier on. He says by 2100, allegedly China's population shrinks from 1.3 billion to approximately 700 million. He gives various other figures about the aging of the population, low birth rates, etc., and says, will these challenges provoke President Xi to move more aggressively with his 2049 China dream? Is he running out of time? And I guess this could apply whether it's demographic pressures, economic pressures, so relative weight in the global economy as other regions start growing faster. Is this a situation where there's nothing so dangerous as someone who's in a hurry?
I think there's an element of that, for sure. I mean, there is, even just in sort of, concrete budgetary terms, China has a kind of window of opportunity now. They don't have a big retired population. They don't have they're not an aged society yet. And therefore they've got a lot more flexibility, plus the population has come from poverty so recently that, you think about the mood in China, it's not one of discontent, right? It's people are pretty well off and they've come a long way. So I think the regime does recognize, that they have an extraordinary amount of flexibility right now, and maybe 20 years from now, they might not. I don't think it's quite as dire. The numbers the questioner said for 2100, that seemed a little bit more dire than what I'm thinking of. But certainly there's going to be a little bit less flexibility in the system and among the population within a decade or two.
Yeah, I think this is a very challenging question, and it's not a standalone challenge. I think it's one of the the consequence or byproducts of what the current institutions that are in place in China. So the economic growth, it does help to move, poverty, millions of people from poverty, but also created a great income inequality. difference in inequality in access to resources such as education, healthcare, and then eventually, the job market. So when you have segmented the market, you keep everyone in this market, all the funds in the market, and then a certain group of people, they have more resources, access to everything than the others. It will create immense, competition and create a lot of pressure on households. Everybody is trying to, get the real resources that they can only find in this market. Unless greater things, broader things can change, I don't think the household families would have the motivation, even with the aggressive, pro demographic growth policies. Now they allow families to have 3 children, but rarely families would make the decision, because of the pressure. So I think it's not a challenge that it can be just solved by pro-growth, demographic growth policy. It's economic. It's an economic challenge, I think.
I would just add to this question that if she is going to move aggressively externally, I don't think this will come as a result of demographic pressures. I think this will be a result of political challenges internally and his own sense of what he wants his role to be in history, right? But while I totally agree with Professor Naughton's assessment that economists underestimated the role of demographics and the demographic dividend, I worry that right now too many people point to demographics as destiny and get too caught up in this. I think actually China has quite a few levers that they can pull, not to have more kids. That's not happening, right? But if you have a retirement age of 60 and 55 as it is now, and already there's announcements that this will be gradually raised, you can raise that faster if need be. There's also a ton of migration that's not happening now. Migration rates have gone down. There's ways to increase the size of large cities. There's ways to increase labor population moving. So flexibility. I think there's a lot of things that the party can do to deal with some of the demographic problem, which in the end is really just a question of productivity. Can you get productivity to grow or not? And I don't think that question is going to result in she moving aggressively externally. But that's just my own interpretation.
I completely agree with that, and would just add, there are a whole host of things that could be done to sort of shift the fundamental economic model towards something that's more friendly to consumption. People keep talking about it and it keeps not happening, right? So, but it still could be done. They don't have to spend all this money on semiconductors. They could spend it on childcare. I don't see that happening tomorrow, but it's a possibility.
Okay, on that note, I think we're coming to the bewitching hour. So thank you all for a very stimulating exchange. I think this makes for a promising start to this series of panels and conversations at this event. So as this panel draws to a close and we transition to the next one, I want to introduce Sunil Kumar, who has been Provost of Johns Hopkins University since 2016. Provost Kumar previously served as the Dean of the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and before that he spent 14 years on the faculty of the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. So I'll turn it over to Provost Kumar now.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for both inviting me and for participating on what seems to be a stimulating and important day of conversations about US-China relations. I'm also here to congratulate Andy Mertha and the other faculty and leaders at SAIS for launching the SAIS China Global Research Center. And so it's a doubly pleasant day for me. So let me say a few words. I don't want to filibuster with 15 minutes of content-free bureaucratic babble. Rather, I wanted to make 3 points. First, as you probably learned from the opening remarks and from Jill in particular, Jill McGovern, Hopkins's connections to China goes back a long time. It has gone back a long time. And as Adam knows very well, our physical center in Nanjing goes back to the days of Deng Xiaoping. And recently, over the last 2 years, we have been working with Nanjing University to extend the center for another 5 years and to work out an arrangement by which it remains impactful. Despite the fact that we have had this center, it has not until recently been as integrated into the rest of the university and into SAIS as it possibly could have been. And so the first point I'd like to make is I'm delighted that the HNC is being brought into mainstream discourse at SAIS, as well as the rest of the university about China. And so in that sense, as the China Global Research Center moves forward in its undertakings, I hope it will take full advantage of one of the unique features of Hopkins, which is it runs this center in Nanjing. And it's a center that's run as an island of true academic or truly free academic inquiry, and therefore will serve our community quite well. The second point I wanted to make was, it was kind of driven home to me this morning. I was talking to leaders of a new but substantial university in another part of the world, not China, about potentially partnering on programs with Hopkins. And I pointed out to them, which is no doubt obvious to the audience here, that the best way for people to get to know a country and its people is to spend time there, especially as students. And we have, Hopkins has significant number of students from China who study here. And Hopkins has, through the Nanjing Center, has a few of our students study in China. And I think this kind of immersion and conversation, I think, helps both sides very well. And, no doubt you've talked about the changing relationship between the two countries and between the two sovereign powers. But regardless of the posture of each country towards the other, understanding more, learning more about each other can only serve us well. And so, so the exchange of students and the building of joint programs, and for example, we have significant number of joint programs with various parts of the university, with Tsinghua University, for example. We have many partner programs with them. And we believe that these programs benefit humanity at large, not just the two institutions. The final point I'd like to make is, of course, Hopkins has a mission to serve the national interest. It is an American university and is funded in significant part by the American government for various activities. But I think the university can manage to have the appropriate firewalls between what serves its national interest and what serves its true mission, which is the free and unrestricted inquiry and dissemination of the results of that inquiry. And I think we can manage that well as an institution, and therefore it behooves us to continue to fully engage in all parts of the world where such inquiry would bear value for society, and not to be overly constrained by our national interest mission. I think we can deliver on that national interest mission if we manage ourselves well. And an example of that is the Global Center. It has reached out, if you look at the themes today, like economics or public health, I think those are areas in which we should not only study China, but study China with the Chinese to the extent that it's possible, and make sure that we and them benefit from this inquiry. So I couldn't be more delighted that this center has been launched. While you may hear opinions to the contrary, in my opinion, this is a very good time to launch this center. And I wish Andy and the other leaders of this center the very best of luck. And I'm also delighted by the fact that this center has reached out well beyond the walls of SAIS. I see people here from almost every part of the university and APL, the Applied Physics Lab, and I think that too bodes very well for the future of this center. There's a similar institute for India that was set up out of medicine and public health, and that is focused almost entirely on our public health and medical and health sciences footprint in India. I suspect that the China Center will be broader than that, at least in its initial conception, and I wish it the very best of luck. So with that, I will make the one announcement that I was asked to make, which is that following a 15-minute break, moderator Yasha Monk will introduce the next panel on the very important and very timely topic of public health in US-China relations. Yasha is a senior fellow at the Hopkins Agora Institute, and he's a political scientist known for his work on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. And he has just completed his 4th book, The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Come Apart and How They Can Unite. I think that next session starts at 11:30. So until then, I suggest you get yourself a little break from this Zoom nightmare, and I look forward to at some point seeing you all in person. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator.
All right, welcome back. We will continue the conference now. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel on public health, cooperation, and competition. We have a wonderful speaker and 4 great panelists, so there's a lot of ideas and content to get through. We will start with a presentation by Yanzhong Huang on the US, China, and public health. Yanzhong is a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor at Seton Hall University School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He's the author of Toxic Politics, China's Environmental Health Crisis and its Challenge to the Chinese State. And very pertinent to our gathering today, he is a graduate, or was a graduate student at the Hopkins Nanjing Center in 1992-1993. Afterwards, we will have comments from Chengda Zhang. Chengda has almost 10 years of experience at Johns Hopkins Medicine International, where he's responsible for research, marketing, business development, and project management in China and other Asian countries. He holds a doctorate of medicine from Fudan University's Shanghai Medical College in China, a master's of biology from Stony Brook University, and a master's of finance from Rutgers Business School. That will be followed by comments from Laura Morlock. Laura is the Executive Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs, as well as a Professor of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's a sociologist with primary research interests in how organizational and managerial factors affect the quality and costs of healthcare. The third commentator will be Nancy Reynolds, who is the Associate Dean of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing and the Director of the Center for Global Initiatives, formerly the Independence Foundation Professor of Nursing at Yale University. Dr. Reynolds is a researcher in the field of chronic illness self-management and a member of the WH Steering Committee for the inaugural State of the World's Nursing Report. And last but very much not least, we will have Xiaoqin Wang. Xiaoqin is a professor of biomedical engineering, neuroscience, and otolaryngology at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and he serves as the director of the Tsinghua Johns Hopkins Joint Center for Biomedical Research in Beijing, China. So with no more further ado, I would like to invite Yanzhong to give us his opening remarks.
Sorry, I was muted. Well, thank you, Professor Monk. Good to see you again. We're both actual colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations. And thanks to Andy and Madeline for organizing this event. It's glad always to be back to speak at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So I guess I'm going to share the slides. Okay. So, but this is, again, a chapter of the book on US-China relations, but we examine the bilateral relationship from a public health perspective. So in this presentation, I will first provide the background, on US-China cooperation. Then we're going to divide that cooperation into 3 stages. The first stage is between 1972, the Nixon's opening, into 2002 on the eve of the SARS outbreak. The second stage will be from 2002 to 2016. That is on the eve of the Trump administration. The third stage will be from, this is a typo, it should be from 2017 to present. So just some background, the US-China cooperation over health, that cooperation could be traced to 1834 when Peter Parker, a US missionary, diplomat, and a physician, founded China's first Western-style hospital in Guangzhou called Canton Hospital, which is, I believe, the site of today's Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hospital of Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. In 1896, US missionary also sponsored 2 Chinese women, Kang Chen, also known as Ida Kang, and Shi Meiyu, known as Mary Stone, to study medicine at the University of Michigan. And the Peking Union Medical College, which was we established in 1906 and was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation through the China Medical Board. It was actually modeled after the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and we all know it remains one of the finest medical schools in China today. So, and in the 1920s, I also want to add that in the 1920s and 30s, efforts of the Peking Union Medical College, professors and students pioneered the development of a 3-tiered healthcare network in Ding County, in Hebei province, that laid the groundwork for the modern public health system in China today, and also inspired the use of barefoot doctors, called 赤脚医生, well, that was introduced by Chairman Mao in the 1960s. And this US-built hospitals and schools continue to function, serving as I pointed out in the book, as silent reminders of American generosity and friendship in the bygone age. President Jimmy Carter, during his meeting with Deng Xiaoping in 1969, actually pleaded for the return of US missionaries. Deng refused, but when President Carter, reminded him of the hospitals and schools, the missionaries had established in China, Deng agreed to actually consider permitting the unrestricted distribution of Bibles in the country. So you can see how, that the U.S. built hospitals and schools actually help U.S. project its soft power and achieving its foreign policy objectives. And it was also interesting in that when after Nixon opened China in the early 1970s, health professionals were among the first Americans invited to visit China. And in 1979, the 2 governments between PRC and the United States, they signed this what we call health protocol, right, that focus on the cooperation in the following fields that include health policy, infectious disease, non-communicable diseases, tobacco control, diagnosis and treatment technology, drug research and development, and medical education. That the 1980s also saw, the emerging role of the US NGOs, the private sector in China's health sector, right? China Medical Board was returned to China in 1981. Project Hope came to China in 1983. They actually worked with the Shanghai municipal government to establish the Shanghai Children's Medical Center, or SCMC. That is still China's leading pediatric medical treatment facility. Also, in terms of the private sector, in October 1982, Bristol Myers Squibb founded the first China-U.S. joint venture pharmaceutical firm in Shanghai. By the end of the 1990s, essentially, all the major U.S. pharmaceutical companies had set up joint ventures in China. So, there's several observations on the cooperation in this stage, right? It's true that China was the primary beneficiary of this kind of cooperation, but that cooperation is never one-way street only. In fact, if you look at the cooperation in the 1990s, when the CDC led a research project in China, that found the lower levels of birth defects in newborn children whose mothers had been taking folic acid for 28 days before and after conception. So the U.S. FDA, then started requiring that food manufacturers add folic acid to bread, flour, and rice. And as a result, the rate of birth defects in newborn children in the United States dropped about 1,300 a year. And that cooperation certainly was facilitated by U.S.-China strategic cooperation in the 1980s because of that need, because they face a common enemy, so they want to counterbalance the former Soviet Union. And that strategic cooperation nurtured a favorable atmosphere for cooperation over health. And important observation of that stage is that health cooperation was largely insulated from the shift in political relations and strategic foundations. So even after the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, but the shift of the strategic foundations, and then the Tiananmen in 1989, which highlight the importance of human rights issues, the cooperation over health continued to expand. Right? So this is my favorite example is that in September 1989, only a month after the Tiananmen incident, Merck signed an agreement with China's Ministry of Health to transfer its hepatitis B vaccine technology to China. Right? This is like a break-even deal. Right? China paid Merck only $7 million, and Merck provided China with the full panoply of technology and equipment necessary, right, for the production of the vaccine, and they also trained the Chinese personnel in quality control. So as a result, right, millions of lives, right, in China have been saved. The HBV prevalence rate in China dropped significantly, right, from 10%, right, to lower than 1% today. Well, the second stage is between 2002 and 2016. We saw this, how the cooperation boomed, right, in the field, in particular, like HIV prevention control, pandemic flu prevention control, the U.S. CDC, they founded that global AIDS program, which is in joint collaboration with China's CDC and the Chinese Ministry of Health. Right? They adopted a new and comprehensive strategy called Prevention for Palliatives that centered on increased surveillance of at-risk groups, provided testing and follow-up care for those who tested positive. That policy, when I was visiting China just a couple of years ago, I found that policy of prevention for palliatives became the central component of China's national strategy on AIDS prevention and control. Right? Also, just the example of cooperation over the pandemic flu. In 2004, the U.S. CDC signed an agreement with the Chinese National Influenza Center, right, in order to help China improve its analysis of seasonal flu strains. Right? Over the next 10 years, the United States trained almost 2,500 Chinese scientists, helped open dozens of laboratories across China, right? But again, this is not just a one-way street, right? That collaboration also proved instrumental in improving the efficacy of the seasonal flu vaccines, up from 10% to more than 50%, according to a recent report from Financial Times. And the two countries also cooperated in 2014 during the Ebola crisis in Western Africa. Right? We found that during the epidemic, staff from the U.S. CDC worked with their counterparts at the Chinese mobile laboratory in Sierra Leone. That, according to HHS, Secretary Cyril Burville, right, played an important role in saving lives and turning the tide of the epidemic. There are some spillover effects, of that cooperation. In 2006, for example, Margaret Chang, a Hong Kong Chinese, became the first Chinese to hold the World Health Organization Director General position. Right? In fact, the United States, worked closely with China in supporting Chang to become elected. So if you look at the patterns of cooperation during that stage, it was very clear, there were very clear attempts to integrate health into the foreign policy agenda. We also found the venues of cooperation increasingly institutionalized, through those forums, the platforms like a Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, we call JCCT, which I attended a couple of years ago in Guangzhou, the SED, Strategic and Economic Dialogue, right? US-China Healthcare Forum, the NGOs also become involved, right? They include the Clinton Foundation through this program, what we call the CHI, right? This is the acronym for the China HIV/AIDS Initiative. The Gates Foundation, Merck launched a $30 million project in Liangshan of Sichuan province, for HIV prevention and control, etc. Right? Again, this is no longer a one-way street, right? China. During the Ebola outbreak, right, when a limited supply of experimental anti-Ebola drug, the ZMapp, became, quickly exhausted. A small private Chinese company raced to produce the drug, based on the information in ZMapp's patent. So within 3 months, the Chinese company had manufactured about 100 doses of a new drug they called, MIL-77. That was believed to have successfully treated a British military nurse who was diagnosed with Ebola while working in Sierra Leone in March 2015. So, for the sake of time, I'm not going to explain, why we have seen this booming collaboration between the two countries. Safe to say, that these two factors become prominent. First, we have seen in both countries started to frame health as a security challenge, and secondly, the 2002-2003 SARS outbreak, right? Led to the growing concern in the United States about the public health issues in China. How that so that was sort of like give them more incentive to work with China in disease prevention and control. So. Well, the third stage is basically we talk about after Trump became the U.S. president. Right? In fact, it is interesting that bilateral cooperation survived the first year of the Trump presidency. That we have seen U.S.-China cooperate in building African CDC. Right? They also held the first round of U.S.-China social and cultural dialogue, in which health was a very important component. They also worked closely on reducing the flow of illicit fentanyl into the United States, and certainly also in the NGO and private sphere, we have seen how Gates, helped Tsinghua University to build this global, health drug discovery institute, to develop the pharmaceutical products for the developing countries. The National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, they started this called Track 2 dialogue on healthcare with China. And but the tensions between the two countries threaten to derail this bilateral health cooperation. We have seen the negative developments on both sides. In China, this foreign NGO law had a chilling effect on health NGOs activities in China. And in 2018, news came out, China refused to share with the United States CDC the H7N9 and sample. Right? And then in June 2019, China unveiled new regulations that puts checks on shipping human genetic materials abroad. Right? On the U.S. side, the Trump administration, essentially allowed the 3 health cooperation agreements with China to expire. It also reduced its the health staff presence in the embassy in Beijing, and health-related research and academic exchange, increasingly was scrutinized from the lens of national security. And some of the Chinese scientists, were fired, right, simply because of their ties to China. And the COVID-19 pandemic has only accelerated that downward spiral, right? It rekindled this disinformation, conspiracy theories on both sides that further undermine the trust and cooperation between the two nations, that were essential for effective cooperation over health. Right? It also inspired massive collateral damage in common perceptions of the U.S. and China. Right? We have seen how in the U.S., right, the negative public opinion reached a historical high, right? And in China too, right, this nationalism, anti-Americanism reached all-time high. That worked together undermine the social basis of cooperation over health. Right? The pandemic, it paradoxically also lowered the bar for global leadership, right? But this is the pandemic that affects every country, including the United States and other developed countries. So, that relieves them, this moral obligation of helping other countries. So, the vaccine nationalism is a very good example of that. So, that actually allowed China to become more assertive in terms of claiming leadership, right, through the so-called mask diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy. But when China was playing a leadership role, right, in providing, medical products, to other countries, the U.S. feels even more threatened, right, by Beijing's global ambitions. So we have seen how, that now you have seen that the Biden administration, actually is also practicing its own vaccine diplomacy and framing that as part of the strategic competition with China. At the time, we thought that they could cooperate with each other, right, on vaccine development, distribution, right? And finally, I think this pandemic led both sides to respectively frame pandemic response as a competition between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. Right? So in China, right, they used this pandemic to showcase the superiority of the Chinese, the political model, right, the so-called Beijing model. The China model. And the United States, they perceived, that as a central threat, to the free world or the liberal democracy. Right? So you have seen, but instead of seeing the countries use foreign policy to pursue objectives, to handling a common cope with a common challenge, where you are actually seeing how health is now being manipulated to achieve foreign policy objectives. That happening and not being for a cooperation but for competition. Right? So to quickly conclude, right, unlike military security relations, U.S.-China health cooperation has been one of the successful examples of U.S.-China engagement. The advocates of the U.S.-China decoupling actually overlooked the enormous benefits of the cooperation over health. And the bottom line is that no matter you like that engagement policies, China, right, the U.S. actually benefited a lot from that cooperation. And the cooperation also generated its own self-sustaining dynamics, that has not only contributed to overall bilateral relationship, but also helped improve global health security. Again, right, we saw that 2014 by the Ebola crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, significantly undermined the foundations of bilateral cooperation over health at a time when such cooperation became all the more important. Right? So in a nutshell, the U.S.-China health cooperation epitomizes and contributes to an increasingly complex and multifaceted bilateral relationship. So with that, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this masterful overview of the state of US and China cooperation on public health. And thank you also for sticking to your allotted time. I hope that all the other panelists will do that, because we want to make sure that we get a little bit of a back and forth discussion going as well. So now with that, I'm excited to hear the first set of comments from Chengda Zhang. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been an honor to be one of the panelists at this event. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about, from a medicine perspective, what we have done over the past 10 years in China, and what we see as a trend going forward in the next few years in terms of international collaboration with China. So first off, we here at Johns Hopkins Medicine is charged with the tripartite mission. That is to raise the standards of education, research, and clinical care, and spread the knowledge across the world. And at Johns Hopkins Medicine International, which is an international arm of medicine, we were established in 1997. And here really represented institutional interest in for our school of medicine and the health system. Our health system, by the way, comprises of 6 hospitals located in Maryland, DC, and Florida. So Johns Hopkins Medicine International's mission is to take care of patients from foreign countries and to provide education and consulting to foreign healthcare entities. So Johns Hopkins Medicine has a strong historical connection with China. And as been mentioned multiple times already in the morning, and also in Dr. Wang's presentation, that so Dr. William Welch, who was the first dean of the medical faculty and also the first leader of our School of Public Health, led the effort to help establish Peking Union Medical College in Beijing. And that was over 100 years ago. And PUMC, Peking Union Medical College, really later became the cradle for a large number of founding fathers of Western medicine in China. And it is now consistently a top-ranked medical university in China. And 4 years ago, when PUMC celebrated its 100-year anniversary, the current dean of medical faculty at Hopkins, Dr. Rothman, attended their celebration. And then later this year, in 2021, would be PUMC's affiliated hospital, PUMCH, PUMC Hospital's 100-year anniversary. And we are also making plans to be part of it. And really, in the past 10 years, we have maintained a close working relationship with PUMC and PUMCH, and we've been conducting various forms of joint educational training programs. So over the past 10 years, our China portfolio has been growing significantly. We've been conducting various forms of projects that really leverage expertise and resources within our medical school and health system. So Yeah, I'll just talk very briefly about the two major programs that we run here. So the first one is what we call the healthcare executive education certificate programs. So, and evidently we're not able to do that in person, but when we were able to over the past 10 years, that program has attracted a total of over 3,000 participants. And 1/3 of them are hospital administrators, leadership, senior management level participants. And 2/3 are healthcare professionals. So, and among the over 2,000 health professionals, we are not only providing education to what we call the frontline healthcare workers, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, but also offering those programs to engineers, clinical engineers, HR professionals, and the finance staff. And currently, within the context of COVID-19, we are running those programs via webinars. What's worth noting in this program that has some Chinese government backup. So one is that Dr. Wang's slides mentioned that the healthcare cooperation program under the U.S. Commerce in China, we are one of the training sites for this HCP, Healthcare Cooperation Program, training sites. And that program was also facilitated by the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. And then also during the then Chinese Vice Premier Liu Yandong's visit of Washington, D.C. to attend the U.S.-China Cultural and Social Dialogue, we signed an MOU with the China National Health Human Resource Development Center to further promote exchange in various aspects. And also within that program, we've been working with various industry sponsors, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, who have been avid supporters and sponsors for those type of programs. Without them, those programs would not be feasible for us. And then other than this educational program, we've been running various types of consulting engagement covering a wide spectrum of healthcare services. So for example, we've done a medical residency training program, trying to build and enhance a standardized competency-based residency program in Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital. We've helped Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou in terms of in helping them enhance their clinical research program. And also more recently, we're receiving a lot of requests to actually help design and plan hospital workflows in the Greenfield Hospital projects in China. So currently, we have one in Xi'an. And then also, we've worked with a primary care company called Labian in Beijing, where we try to build the healthcare infrastructure and the workforce with them. And the last, in terms of home care, which is still a new concept in China, but not that new in the United States. There's an entrepreneur in China, in Zhongshan, Guangzhou, who's keen to try the home care concept. So we have worked with him for a number of years trying to set up the home care infrastructure for them. So I think in terms of looking forward, medicine and welfare or the well-being of mankind tend not to be politically implicated. We're not, so medicine, from our point of view, medicine is not something that is not something that's similar to what essentially triggers the current tension between US and China, for example, in the areas of trade and high technology. And we are confident that we will continue to see increasing desire in the medical community in China to seek international collaboration with the US. And that is manifested by the continuous request for international collaboration, even during the pandemic. And then also we're seeing some innovation in the collaboration work we've done. So now especially in the East Asian culture, where people business culture essentially, people tend to want to see each other in person. But now with COVID, a lot of our work has been transferred online, and then the quality has been pretty good. And also we're seeing that in terms of healthcare, China has been developing really fast. And over the past 10, 15 years. So for example, clinical volume, was a lot of medical faculty that travel with us to China are really shocked by the clinical volume of a single hospital in China. So, and also in terms of quality, concept of patient-centered care. But we also see a large gaps still exist before healthcare in China is able to reach the next level. For example, the concept of precision medicine is still at a conceptual level in China. But what we see is the precision medicine may be one of the areas that we can do more work with interested parties in China. So overall, to conclude, we're optimistic about the prospect of a healthcare collaboration working with China in the future. So the COVID has slowed everything down, everybody down, but we anticipate that it'll pick up very quickly. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker, Dr. Lauren Morlock. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chengda, for this great on-the-ground account of what the cooperation looks like in practice. And without further ado, now on to Laura Morlock. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Hello. It's my pleasure to be part of this conference. I would like to thank the organizers and my warmest congratulations to everyone who's been involved in founding the SAIS China Global Research Center. I would also like to express my deep appreciation to Dr. Huang for his very thoughtful and helpful and I think engaging book chapter. What I would like to do is place a few of the activities of our school within the context of the framework and the themes that he has provided. You can think of me as doing a brief but deep dive into Dr. Huang's chapter and providing a few footnotes and examples. So our school's 105 years old. We've been involved with China from day one. Jill McGovern, in her wonderful talk this morning, mentioned that. And so I'm not going to talk about our early activities. What I'd like to do is fast forward to the years 2002 to 2016, what Dr. Huang has referred to as the golden age of cooperation. And in retrospect, it just certainly looks golden. I'd like to provide two examples from the perspective of our school. Really in the middle of this time period, about 2006, 2007, the deans of the schools of public health at Peking University and Fudan University in Shanghai persuaded our dean at the time, Mike Clegg, that what the growing numbers of schools of public health in China really needed was what they called a school for deans. How do you run a school of public health? How do you fulfill the mission, design a curriculum, have outreach, serve your community, maintain financial viability? These are the kinds of things that deans worry about. Well, this idea ultimately became the leadership workshops in public health education and training. Our school convened the first meeting in Baltimore in 2009, and a number of schools of public health from China attended. Those were followed each year by meetings in Beijing and Shanghai. And the idea was to rotate among the three locations, with usually from 20 to 50 schools of public health in China participating. A second example, and I'll be very brief, but I think it's also a great illustration of this time period, we were engaged in a number of discussions with the Tsinghua University Institute for Hospital Management. And ultimately, what we did was launch a Doctor of Public Health degree program based at Tsinghua University. The degree was a Hopkins degree. The courses were provided on-site at Tsinghua, on-site in Baltimore, and online. The target group was part-time students, mid-career professionals. And I want to mention that the funding for the planning phase was Chinese funding provided by that Capital Healthcare Group. And under the sponsorship of Tsinghua University, we quickly received approval from the Ministry of Education. So that was a truly golden time. Since then, we've enrolled 4 cohorts in that program. There are 110 students from all health sectors in China represented among these cohorts. So what now? I would like to turn to the present and what Dr. Huang has referred to as a time period of cooperation under threat. I'll provide a couple of examples. First example, 3 weeks ago, we convened a forum of our DRPH students at Tsinghua. They and the faculty at Tsinghua were in Beijing. We participated online. There were a series of speeches. And one was from the Dean of the Institute of Hospital Management, who is a former Vice Minister of Health. And he was talking to the students about the current role of the Communist Party in Chinese public hospitals. There's always been a role, but until about 5 years ago, it could be described as a ceremonial role. It is far from that now. It is a powerful position, the top position within public hospitals. And Dean Huang, who had very carefully chosen words, was trying to explain to the students how they might be able to seek opportunities, create opportunities within this structure. Of course, for us in the program, the question is, how can we help our students function and, if possible, flourish within this new reality? I'll provide one more example. We're now deeply involved in discussions with the brand new School of Public Health at Tsinghua University. The inaugural dean is Margaret Chan, who is featured in Dr. Huang's chapter and was just mentioned in his presentation. And there we are exploring how to cooperate within this new reality that Dr. Huang describes. So the end of this chapter, I think Dr. Huang is calling really for a reset of the current relationship at the highest political level. And I think that's right. But what can we do at our level? Can we work from an academic base and continue to build, maintain, and strengthen bridges among our schools of public health that perhaps can help form a foundation for broader relationships? I don't know, and it's a tough question, but I hope you don't think it's naive. We can discuss that later. I would like to end on a note both of determination and hope. Thanks very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Laura, for these great remarks. And we're going to continue with Nancy Reynolds. Nancy, take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to participate in this conference and to hear the comments of Dr. Huang. His comments really resonate with me in the experiences that I've had in my collaborative health promotion work in China to date. And the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing actually has a really rich heritage in its collaborative relationships in China. And they have actually, the school has been highly influential in the development of nursing, both in the US and China for over 100 years now. And I would just like to highlight two activities that I think have been particularly influential. One is the relationship that the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing has had with PUMC. Like medicine, the early advancement of nursing in China was a collective effort of the missionary medicine, private foundations, and collaborations between Chinese and US academics. The first preparatory nursing course in the United States was developed at the Johns Hopkins Hospital School of Nursing in 1901. And it was really just a few years later that Hopkins became involved in the development of the first academic nursing program in China. In 1911, John Rockefeller sent a delegation which included Dr. William Welch, as someone mentioned earlier, from the School of Medicine and the founding physician of the School of Hygiene and Public Health at Hopkins. He went to China to gather information and to advise on how to help the Chinese to bring Western medicine to China. And in 1914, the Rockefeller Foundation established and endowed the Chinese Medical Board of New York, which funded the founding of the PUMC School of Medicine in 1917. And then in 1920, it funded the development of the School of Nursing. Dr. Welch invited Anna Wolff, who was a 1915 graduate of the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing and a nursing instructor and supervisor at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, to come to China to found the PUMC School of Nursing. And she then became the first dean of the PUM School of Nursing, and a position that she held until 1926. And according to Mary Bullock, PUMC was the American transplant of Johns Hopkins University. And then nearly 75 years later, the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing helped to develop China's first PhD in nursing program. In 2001, the PUMC School of Nursing Dean, Professor Ning Shen, visited the Chinese Medical Board as part of the centennial celebration of Rockefeller University in New York City. She then traveled to Baltimore to initiate broad discussion of advancing graduate nursing education at PUMC with our former dean, Martha Hill. Both deans were well aware that the schools of nursing at both universities shared the same nurse leader, Anna Wolff, early in their history. And this shared legacy brought particular significance to their interest in finding meaningful ways to collaborate. And Dean Shen invited Dean Hill to Beijing for the 75th anniversary of PUMC for further discussion in these conversations. And it became very clear that sort of the next way forward was to develop a doctoral program. So Dean Hill, along with several of our faculty members, were very much in part of developing that first PhD program, which has become very successful. There are now many PhD programs of nursing in China, and the preparation of many nursing scientists, and it's really improved the level of education there as well. You know, I've also been very involved with education of nurses at the Central South University, the Shanghai School of Nursing. And my work actually began there through the Yale China Association as member of the health committee and a trustee of the board there. And in addition to the development of the hospital, with Dr. Huang mentioned earlier, you know, Yale China Association has maintained a long relationship of faculty exchanges, student exchanges, fellowships, research. And in fact, as the capacity has grown in Changsha and the Central South University, the relationship of the nature of that collaboration has really changed so that it's much more a partnership now. And most recently, we've been planning in interdisciplinary schools of medicine, public health, nursing, along with the government, the regional government in China, to work together to build primary healthcare in rural China, where access to routine healthcare services is still quite limited. But given COVID situation, that project has been somewhat on hold. But the School of Nursing at Hopkins, we stay very engaged and work with several other universities in China, and we have MOUs in place with 5 universities. We bring many visiting scholars over to the School of Nursing. We do a lot of joint research and publication. Much of this has been in the area of HIV. And we hold joint conferences and research seminars. And I feel that the work that I've done in China, along with my colleagues, has been so rich and meaningful, I think, on both sides. Even this year, when the visiting scholars weren't able to come, we held a reunion, and all of our former scholars did a virtual reunion sharing what they're currently doing. But I'm very concerned about the political climate right now. And I think we were hoping to see a reset with the Biden administration, but I think that there are quite a few tensions, as the others have spoken about. And unfortunately, I do think it's starting to affect the health domain, which has somewhat flown under the radar and really has been an area for joint and very meaningful work. And I do hope we can be optimistic going forward. But I know, for example, many of our scholars who come here to study get national scholarships. And it'd be very easy for China to stop funding those. And I think that it's been very prestigious for scholars to come to the United States and to study. But I think the way we've handled COVID, I think, has raised some eyebrows. And I also think it's been a great concern to Asians seeing the way some of the anti-Asian sentiments that have been expressed in the US. So I hope as COVID dissipates that we can generate positive working relationships again. And I'll look forward to more discussion. So I'll welcome our next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And as our last commenter, I look forward to hearing from Xiaoqun Wang. Xiaoqun, take the floor.
Hello, can you hear me? Well, I want to thank the organizer for inviting me to this event. Most conference I go, a scientific conference, I'm a research scientist. And I also want to take the opportunity to congratulate SAIS colleagues for launching this global center. I agree fully hearted with Dean's remark at the beginning. This is the time to do it, and the SAIS and Hopkins is a place to do it, given the importance of SONA-US relationship. And I also want to mention a little bit, just before I make other remarks, that my personal journey, that is coincident with many of the things we talk about here. When Richard Nixon came to China in 1973, I was in middle school. And as many Chinese, there was huge news. American president and his wife walked down the stair of an airplane on Beijing airport. I never forgot that news. And then when I come to America as a graduate student, 1985, at around time Nanjing Center started, and I read about it, I would see that many years after, I still want to see this, what Hopkins did, our president back then, Dr. Miller, is a far-reaching historical move to put Hopkins on the world stage and in this event. So I think this is a very important thing that the SAIS continue to support. So for the events today, I want to mention that my department, the Department of Biomedical Engineering, which belongs to both School of Engineering, Whiting School of Engineering, and Medical School of Medicine. We have been engaging with Tsinghua University in Beijing for over decades now, and a couple of my colleagues earlier, Laurie and said about the public health engagement with Tsinghua. So back in 2008, through the Whiting School of Engineering and supported by university, we established the joint center in biomedical engineering between our department and the Tsinghua University. There's an MOU signed by both universities. And I accompanied back then the provost, Christina Johnson, and the dean of engineering school to Beijing to sign MOU. And that framework has allowed us to support education and research education exchange and research collaborations between two schools over the last decades, mainly in the field of biomedical engineering, which concern medical instrumentation and public health as related. And in a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, our department has initiated, and with Tsinghua University, a joint program, a dual master program in biomedical engineering. And now this program has been running for 2 years, and it started before COVID. The student can enter this program either through Johns Hopkins or through Tsinghua University from anywhere in the world. And they spend the first year in Baltimore, in Hopkins, taking our classes, and the second year in Tsinghua University, pursuing research. At the end of their 2-year training, they receive 2 degrees, master's degrees, one from Johns Hopkins, one from Tsinghua. It's a highly popular, highly sought after program. And unfortunately, the COVID-19 situation has put a little bit break on this. So these and many other examples that our department has pursued in the Whiting School of Engineering with the University in China has been mutually beneficial. But my comments, the main comments I want to make in light of the subject of today's conference is regarding my experience as a scientist, a working scientist here in a university, how we feel and how in the current situation. Now, I'm glad that the organizers put this panel, the subject of the panel as public health after the panel 1 of economics. I think this is timely. And I see there are more corporations in public health, there are more needs for corporations in public health than competition. Dr. Huang's chapter was brilliant writing with many details. I read them and I truly enjoy many historical accounts of events between US, China, and between Hopkins and the Chinese universities. Some of them I personally experienced in the last several decades. Now, the issue here, I think I very much agree with Laura's comments earlier regarding the interactions between us and the University of China. My argument would be that even despite in the current political situation, in the domain of public health, we should appeal and argue for engagement, not decoupling. Because public health is not issue a single country can handle. COVID-19 situation that all of us just experienced since last year is unfortunately the best example to demonstrate that. We're on the same boat. Events like that happening, starting from China can affect the United States, and starting from any other countries that can affect the rest of the world. This is where United States academic community here should take the leadership and engage China, but not decouple, not decouple it. Now, also I want to argue that this engagement should happen at both government level and the community level. In the government level, as many of you have spoken already, there are a lot of political factors, their administration from last to present, how they handle this. That's one thing. But another level is community level. Community level, I mean, is that public health policies has to be implemented, carried out by professionals in medicine, in nursing, in public health. These are the grounded troops that will carry out politicians' wills and government policies. But right now, the commitment, the community level is engagement is under threat. In fact, severe damage by many policies initiated by previous administration. As many of you know, and some of the speakers alluded to this earlier, many political policies implemented by last administration, and unfortunately many of them continue, have putting a very chilling effect of scientists, specifically scientists with Chinese heritage. The collaboration between ground level scientists here in the United States and with those in China have largely come to a halt right now. Okay. People stay away from this because of many concerns, many suspicions, unfounded in many cases. This seriously damage any collaborations in public health, in medicine, in this field between the United States and China. And this is something I strongly argue that centers like SAIS's new China Center should study. It should study the consequence of government policy on such issues, and this is not trivial. Now, how do we solve this problem? The problem is big, but one can argue that the situation we're facing now is perhaps no more difficult than 100 years ago, in 1930s, 1920s, when Hopkins physician, Dr. Welch, took months on boat across Atlantic, across the Pacific, from the United States to China to help build the Union Memorial Hospital in Peking. I think what we're now is, despite of all the political difficulties and the challenges, we're in much better situation than 100 years ago. That's because over the last 30, 40 years, the exchange at the scientific level, at the education level, between the United States and China have paved a strong foundation. There are many scholars here and in China that are trained in the United States and have experience in China. So for us to bring the relationship at the scientific community and the government level back to a productive level, I think is possible. But to do so, we must depolarize public health issue. This is not something that it should be publicized, politicized, as it is now in many cases. This should be decoupled from politics, and it should be depolarized. Only then, and until then, and only then, I think we can see a healthy relationship between two countries in this field, and that will benefit the people of both country and the entire humanity. So I'll stop my comments here.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're really getting a great debate going already in the initial remarks and the responses to them, but I look forward to half an hour of more informal back and forth in the Q&A. It seems to me that the picture that has emerged so far is somewhat gray on gray. On the one hand, there is great emphasis on the importance of public health collaboration between the United States and China, as well as some of its ongoing promise. On the other side, we see a lot of gray and dark clouds on the horizon. So I'd like to double down in my first question on some of those clouds. The picture that emerges is still relatively optimistic. But when I look at a question from Charles Wiener, for example, he's asking panelists whether health cooperation can really remain an insulated policy area where cooperation is much more possible in light of Trump, COVID, and the bipartisan antipathy towards China in the United States. Zoran Lee has a question that goes in a similar direction. They ask, do you think the international attempt to trace COVID-19 in China, which the Chinese government cannot accept, will undermine future collaboration? So I take this to be a question about the lab leak theory, which was pretty much banished from the public sphere in the United States for 15 months, but has recently become quite prominent, both because it's now taken seriously at the highest levels of the Biden administration and because mainstream media has started to talk about it, whether it's in the New York Times and the Washington Post or just a couple of days ago, Jon Stewart, who talked about it on the on Stephen Colbert's show, to a lot of resonance on social media and so on. So I guess the way that I would put the question is, are we being too optimistic about the prospects of collaboration in public health in this area? And in fact, are there any downsides to such collaboration that we have not talked about from the perspective of the United States? Are the downsides to this collaboration we have to take more seriously in terms of some of the risks of a political culture in China, some of the secrecy around the pandemic and other issues? Is there a case to be made to actually limit cooperation because of those things? Who would like to respond? Yes, go ahead.
Sure, I'd be happy to address this question. Actually, this is Charles and Jordan both asked this similar questions. I think in terms of whether that the cooperation over health is still being insulated by politics, the answer is definitely a no, right? But if you look at the momentum of the cooperation, even for the first 3 months into the pandemic, right? If you just look at the number of U.S.-China papers, that specifically look at, the COVID-19, actually the papers that were authored by both Chinese and American scholars, scientists, actually increased, right, in the first 3 months of 2020. Right, you only saw the amount, this collaboration, dropped, in the year, after, China began to order, that all the COVID-related research had to be reviewed and approved, by the government, right, before publication. And certainly, right, in the United States, right, every thing, including that the U.S.-China cooperation of public health had to be scrutinized from the lens of national security. Didn't help, right? So you've seen how, this kind of insulation, right, are no longer existent. Now it's, there's this risk of, that U.S.-China cooperation being derailed, right, by, this focus on U.S.-China strategic competition, right? This debate, on the origins of the outbreak, especially, right, of the validity of the lab escape theory, is a very good example, right? On the one hand, highlight the importance of the U.S.-China cooperation, right, especially over the issue of biosafety and biosecurity. But on the other hand, right, with that issue being so politicized, right, the political stake becomes so high, right, it is just impossible, right, for China to receive American scientists, right, to have unfettered access, right, in the country. Right. In the meantime, while there's even in the United States, we have, this, increasing suspicion, right, of the U.S.-China cooperation over health, right? This now reports, seems to suggest that the United States, through the National Institute of Health, funded, potentially funded the gain of function research in the Wuhan Institute of Laboratory, right? So, people start to question, right, that whether it was actually that cooperation is, as you just suggested, has any bad impacts, right? Especially if it's connected with that pandemic, or if there's evidence supporting that gain of function research, actually is associated with that pandemic. Already we have heard by this in some U.S. universities talking about blocking all sorts of projects, because they were scared of, the headlines, that was suggesting anyway, that, they are scientists or scholars actually engaging in that kind of research or any kind of thing that is considered illicit. So
And yeah,
basically the push for the investigation of this lab escape theory, may exacerbate this mutual suspicions and make cooperation, even less likely.
any other thoughts on this subject?
Maybe I will make comments. I want to say that we learn a lot from history, and in Chinese they're saying that you become wise, you learn history. I think on the subject of public health, this COVID-19, what happened in last year, only year and a half, is profoundly important for policymakers, for scholars, like I said, this China Center study, because much of what happening since last January, scientifically or medically, could have been prevented. Much happening in this country could have been prevented had we know more what is happening in China just several months earlier. But if you look at the news that US-China's collaboration in health, in medicine, was extensive until a couple of years ago. In fact, NIH, Department of Public Health in the United States, NIH has office in Beijing and has program officers, researchers hanging around in China. But a couple of years ago, in the last administration, I read they cut the budget, they remove it. But imagine in a more peaceful, collaborative environment where United States health professionals, public health professionals, infectious disease personnel are in China working with Chinese colleagues. Much can be learned and much can be avoided what will happen here. In fact, what is happening now is in the block. My understanding is that when the COVID outbreak started early last year in China, and the NIH, this is through Dr. Fauci's public remarks, NIH wants to send an expert to China to look at what's going on, and it was turned down. Unfortunately, by then, it was well isolated. This is very unfortunate, but I think it's worse for us, for scholars in this field, to study how to prevent the next one. How would you prevent this situation from happening again? Because if it is happening like this now, then this is what we got. So I think that's actually very important when we talk about what to do in the future. But serious analysis what happened in the past and the very recent past, last 5 years, that led into that. So I think that's important to listen to them.
I'll just add in, I think we would all agree the importance now of international cooperation for dealing with the COVID pandemic and for future prevention. But I'm very concerned even right now. It's very obvious that vaccines work very well, but we're not being very effective at getting them distributed in an equitable way. And really, WHO has potentially a very important role to play here, but it's handicapped in its ability to really operate as effectively as maybe it could.
So if I can just very quickly share my comments. So I think, so one of the questions raised is that China cannot accept the second round of investigation into the origin of COVID-19. From my perspective, I think it might be a little early at this point to make that assumption. I think, of course, there are different parties, different people doing things in the background, and I'm still a bit at this point optimistic about the outcome of if you will, the resolution of this conflict, if you will. I think, and I think in terms of international collaboration within the context of the pandemic and the previous Trump administration. I think one thing to take note of is that we should recognize the vast difference in the political system, in the operation of the political system between the United States and China. I think for China in the past couple of years, in particular, the government has been playing an increasingly dominant role in all aspects of the society. So we're seeing government entities tend to taking greater control in not only the public sectors, which includes universities, hospitals, and so forth, but also in the private sectors, which we did not see 20 years ago or 15 years ago. So that would give the government a significant amount of power to basically create directions for various aspects of the society, and that includes healthcare. And once a certain political propaganda is created, all aspects within that industry or within that field must follow that propaganda with no hesitation. So so that could potentially create some negative force to international collaboration between U.S. and China. But I think, but still, at this point, it's too soon to tell. I think overall, from what we have observed over the past 12 to 18 months, the desire, as I mentioned earlier, the desire for collaboration coming from China has never stopped. It actually increased, and that's reflective of the growing needs for high quality healthcare in the country. Yeah.
Laura, would you like to come on with this? No obligation, just an invitation.
No, actually, I was going to make a very similar comment that what Dr. Huang has described as the tightening of control extends down to the very basic levels of hospitals, and I'm more familiar with the public sector, but the top position now in public organizations is held by the party secretary, and the influence is profound.
Yeah, that's something to chew on, I think. As we're speaking, there's a trial going on of Unmaking, who was a professor at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and he's one of the first people who've been caught up in federal charges of spying on behalf of China. It's looking in the early stages of a trial as though the trial is going to be a big failure, and it may well turn out that he was spuriously accused for very minor failure to disclose certain things that he didn't realize he had to disclose, and there was nothing particularly fishy going on. So that speaks, I think, to a question by David Lampton, which is, how do you assess the effects of congressional hearings and executive branch investigations, as well as, I suppose, these law enforcement investigations, examining international property rights transfer to China through collaborative grants and collaborations with institutions like the National Institutes of Health? What will be the effect on getting foreign and Chinese talents in our programs? And how would you assess the cost benefit to our overall national research efforts?
Well, I think I'm going to just chime in. You know, I think, as I mentioned in the chapter, I think pharmaceutical related intellectual property issue has not been a major concern, right, in U.S.-China cooperation over health. In fact, we have seen, China seems to have been doing a very good job in terms of protecting pharmaceutical-related intellectual property rights. In fact, 2009, when there's a Chinese company, I believe it's the Beiyun pharmaceutical firm in Guangzhou, applied for compulsory licensing of Tamiflu during the epidemic, during the pandemic, which is completely justifiable, right? If you talk about the TRIPS public health agreement, right, the Doha Declaration, but China actually, the government actually denied the request. Apparently, right, is based on the concerns, that might violate the TRIPS agreement. But now, right, seeing, right, that this, when everything, right, this talk about the US-China, this cooperation, right, it's now framed, right, in the terms of strategic competition, right? Even though there's, we talk about this huge, right, this necessity of an importance of cooperation with China, because, if you just look at the G7, right, the statement, they want to end the pandemic by 2022. They want to strengthen the global health security, but in the absence of cooperation from China, right, it will be unrealistic to achieve the collective goal of ending the pandemic by next year, right? And furthermore, if you want to strengthen our collective defenses against the threats to global health, through coordination on like global manufacturing capacity, improvement, early warning system, that also requires cooperation of China, because China, after all, played a central role in this dynamics of health, development, and security. But the problem here is that now all kinds of this cooperation, right, and now again has to be framed in terms of strategic competition, even for like vaccine sharing, right? That is the intellectual property rights. We have seen this growing mounting pressure, right, for the IP waiver, right? But you have seen how during the development of the vaccines, there's all these reports, for example, about how Chinese hackers try to hack into Moderna's system, stealing the U.S. the vaccine making secrets, so when in game theoretical terms, right, this cheating became a major concern, right, in U.S.-China cooperation, right? That this further cooperation might just becomes increasingly unlikely. Even though that benefits of the cooperation, I think, continue to outweigh by the risk or the cost of the IP transfer. In fact, I would propose the United States, if they're really serious about ending this pandemic, they should share the Moderna, the vaccine making technologies with China, right? Because if we agree, right, there's, we cannot be free, be safe unless everybody is safe, right? You cannot end that pandemic, unless, right, you have everybody on this pandemic is also safe from that pandemic. So I think the United States should continue to encourage, right, or send a clear signal, right, to encourage academic exchange with the Chinese scientists, including facilitating Chinese scientists to apply for grants and conduct health research at U.S. universities and institutions. And unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case. Even we have a regime change, right? When the Biden administration took over, right? They have, so what happened in G7, right? This is the clear signal, right? They want to use the G7, right, to counterbalance China's, influence or the threat to democracy, right? Professor Monk is the expert on that. And then in terms of cooperation with China, right, you would hope or you would expect that they're going to be cooperating with China over public health, right, to end the pandemic. But instead, the climate change become the #1 priority, right? The way they send, Secretary Kerry to China. So, this is just I found this just rather unfortunate.
Yeah, Nancy.
I thought it would be interesting to address the question Laura brought up at the end of her talk about whether or not there's anything we can or should be doing right now that as academics, if I understood your question correctly.
Yeah, and I would love to also discuss thoughts about an issue you alluded to, Nancy, the visa, processing issues right now. Our school, typically there's students from 60 to 80 countries, but China is by far the largest, sender of students. We have 170 students who accepted our offer for this coming year. And we're in touch with many of them. And, consulates are slow to open. They give interviews, appointments for interviews, then they cancel the appointments. So between the visa processing issues and the travel restrictions, which we probably can't do much about, I think the flow of scholars that we have depended on for decades, and really have helped cement ties, that's also in real jeopardy. I'd love to have people's thoughts about that.
Any thoughts specifically on this? I love personal advice as well, as somebody who's learning Chinese and was hoping to spend the full term when I'm not teaching in China, and that doesn't look like it's particularly realistic at the moment. So if you have any personal advice, feel free to chat me afterwards. No, how can we maintain certainly the flow of students in both directions in this situation? I think Xiaoxin, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I want to just echo Laura's comments that the dual degree program I mentioned that we in Hopkins Medical Engineer and Tsinghua established 3 years ago. And this year, our students are planning to come join us in person in the fall because Hopkins open. Then we began to have a problem with students not getting visa. Not only some students cannot get an appointment, even they go to the interview. I don't know how much you guys pay attention to this. Many students are just getting rejected for very simple, just one line, and they have no clue. And we have our program officer here, manager have no clue why they rejected. Now our students come from engineering background, and but biomedical engineering is not a sensitive area. It's not a space technology, right? But apparently the consulars and the embassy of the United States, when they review visa, they have a list of certain things. People from certain schools and certain majors, they want to reject. I mean, some of them you can read in the papers. This creates a problem because if we generate perception in Chinese students that they can be rejected randomly, without expectation, without prediction, then people will stop coming. I mean, they will flow to other countries. So this is a problem. I think I'm glad Laura brought up and then Nancy mentioned that at a universal level and it works across all universities in the United States should address it because you should have a transparency policy. And if a student has excellent academic credentials, which is a student we and many of your program here is admitted, and they don't have a criminal background, there is no wrongdoing, they should have expected outcome from the visa. Otherwise, it becomes random. This is United States. You should have something that's transparent to all the citizens, right? If we have a store. So I think that's the issue that is perhaps can be, this is a much smaller issue than others, but it is a serious issue that all the graduate programs start facing this year because we are opening. So I think that's important.
If there's one mistake that political scientists like me always make, it's to project linearly out into the future, and as we've from whatever the current trend is, and as we've heard from Nanjing at the beginning of our session, there's been these very distinct phases in US-China cooperation on public health. I think if we look at the trend of the last few years, the natural conclusion would be to be very pessimistic about what that state might look like 15 or 30 years from now. But that I think would be a mistake. So with about 4 or 5 minutes left on the panel, I'm going to make an unfair request, which is to ask each of you to make your best point estimate to what US-China cooperation on public health might look like, let's say in 2040 or 2050. Why don't I'm gonna just call on people. So Nanjing, if you want to go first, and then I'll go in order of the presentations.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I think when we talk again about the U.S.-China cooperation, right, you have to not only look at the necessity, right, what the priority, right, which should be prioritized, right, in terms of U.S.-China cooperation. I could think of, collaboration of the distribution of the vaccines globally. I could think of biosafety and the biosecurity issues. I could think of like to facilitate the travel, between the two sides, right? But in the meantime, we need to also look at the, the feasibility, right? Because especially given the tensions between the two, some like, the sharing of the vaccine technologies, probably is less likely, right? Compared with, right, the relaxation of the international travel, which after all takes, a little bit more than like common sense and communication, right, to get it done. I think so. We got to be realistic, and in terms of the U.S.-China cooperation in the coming months, or maybe in the coming year. I think maybe we should focus on, relaxation of the international travel. That certainly I have seen the Biden administration has taken some very positive steps, right, in making it now easy for Chinese students to travel to the United States, right? Unlike this policy, I found very ridiculous, right, under the Trump administration. Even though the China had, almost no cases, right, still require, right, the Chinese students to connect, right, through a third country, right, before they could, and stay there for 14 days before they could travel to the United States. That is just, even though they didn't have the cases, if they stay there for 14 days, the risk can become even higher, So you see how this public policy sometimes can be so, like ridiculous, and so cumbersome. I would hope that China could do the similar thing, right, in terms of, the realizing or recognizing, that the zero tolerance strategy is not sustainable, right? It's the we have to live with the virus, so that means, that you cannot just keep on tightening the borders, right? Especially, I think that policy of now quarantine people in designated places for more than 14 days, in some places now even like 35 days, is not only unscientific, it is also unnecessary. Thank you.
Wonderful for that forceful plea for reopening. We really have only a minute or two left, but I would love to hear from each of you just for 20 seconds. Chengda.
Yeah, so you're asking in 20 or 30 years, what would U.S.-China healthcare collaboration look like? So to answer that, if you look back 20 years, 30 years, so we're just seeing the resumption of the relationship, just started build. So 20, 30 years later, I think I'm optimistic to see a more in-depth version of the relationship, of the collaborative relationship between U.S. and China. Things are going to look a lot better than it is now.
All right, that is a very succinct and very optimistic plea. Laura.
I'd like to agree with Chengda's vision and Dr. Huang's comments. And I think one area where we can work is at the Association of Universities level. There is, they can be powerful in their influence, and or maybe I should just say influential in their influence. And maybe we can work together among the universities on the visa issues.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think that's great, an idea. And yeah, I was going to say the same thing as the others. I think we've seen, listening to the history, peaks and valleys, and maybe we're in one of the valleys now. And I would hope maybe by then we'll have a peak.
I would say that maybe it should be better now, but I would expect, I hope that in 10, 20 years in that one, that public health will be issue as important as global warming, and is less politicized as other things. And because we have no other choice. We're in the same earth, we're infected by same disease. Disease has no border, no nationality. And I think the recognition of global warming is an important issue for everyone. That should be applied to public health. And this country has a responsibility to take a leadership on that.
Well, this was a wonderful panel, and I think the last set of comments was a great preview to our next panel, which starts at 1 p.m. And is about the future of US-China relations. So I believe at 2 p.m. presumably, since it's 1 p.m. now. I'm in Berlin, so I may be getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure it must be at 2 p.m. So all that remains to thank me now is, for me to do now is to thank everybody for your wonderful contributions to this panel, to wish all of our attendees a wonderful lunch break, and to say that we hope to see you back here in just a little bit under an hour. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.